Hello everyone, is Bringanthecheos Glizzy for another What If Beerus is an Olympian god of destruction. Beerus has been erased because of the mistake Goku, but he encountered the fathers of all angels. He is in a new world field of gods. What will happen to a former god?
The Olympian God of Destruction. Chapter 20, The Titanomachy XIII. Roughly 3 days earlier, atop Mount Olympus. I must say, this is quite the fascinating turn of events. Gaia remarked with an intrigued smile, following Beerus's explanation of what had happened the previous night in the courtyard they now stood on. The primordial goddess folding her arms beneath her enormous breasts, slightly squishing their voluminous flesh up as they were perched over her forearms, as she stood side by side with her student of sorts. The sword acting as a bridge of sorts between you and your domain to make harnessing it much easier, and then acting as the conduit to which your domain's power is unleashed. My boys really have outdone themselves here. They have indeed. Beerus nodded, his sword already out and held out for the goddess' eyes as he conversed with the Earth Mother, totally ignoring some of the stares gotten from nymphs at Gaia's physical presence. His amber eyes able to spot the pride shining through on the protogenous features after finding out what the blade they'd forged for Beerus had already accomplished in just one test. And here I thought that dummy would last at least half a year before you finally destroyed it. She couldn't help but quip amusedly, turning her head to look more at him opposed to the sword. It would seem, however, that the weapon my boys crafted for you has, in a way, rapidly pushed up your progress in this regard. Yes. But only when the sword is being wielded, as of now. Something I seek to rectify in the future, as I'd rather not have to use this as a crutch to access my domain's power. Beerus was quick to say, having no intention of allowing his domain's power usage dependent on an item in the future, as that would be a recipe for disaster in case her were ever disarmed, and also didn't sit well with him in general. Even still, I think I shall be using this more often for now than I thought I would, as I'd like to discover what else it's capable of. And you'll need another training dummy for that. The primordial smiled kindly. That'll be no issue. I'll even do you one better, and have it come back every time it's destroyed from now on, so that you can practice with your new sword on it as much as you like. And of course, without it as well. That's good to hear. Even as Beerus said this, he felt the ground around where the previous dummy had stood shift around, as within an instant, a new one that was identical to the first in appearance molded itself out of the ground and before him with an earthy aura briefly around it. The dummy just waiting to be practiced onto his heart's content, as said aura then disappeared from sight merely a second later. Having a self-remaking dummy will definitely make testing this new sword out as much as I'd like a rather simple affair. Speaking of testing the sword's capabilities. Gaia turned to him fully with a certain gleam in her vibrant, green pools. Seeing as it's able to allow you to harness your domain's power, which is the second stage of your training that we talked about, there's a chance it might be able to help you achieve the third stage as well. You think that might actually be possible? Now she really had his attention. It very well could be. She nodded again. I'm not fully certain, since a situation like this has never come up before, but if that blade can aid you in achieving the second stage so quickly ahead of time, then it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to assume it could potentially do the same for the third and final one. The hardest part of the process. Ascension. I'm all ears. Beerus grinned. All you need is tell me how it's done and I'll see if it can be. Very well. The third stage simply involves you pulling every last bit of the essence of your domain, or domains, into yourself all at once. And by that, I mean inside your soul. Beerus blinked in confusion. Hold on, haven't I technically done part of that already with the first stage? No, that was different. In the first stage, when you became bonded to your domain, it mainly wrapped around your soul and loosely intertwined itself with your being. Well, loosely compared to what it'll be in the final stage. Here, you'll be pulling all of its metaphysical essence inside your soul, totally encompassing it, rather than the other way around. This'll have the effect of intertwining it all with your being on a far deeper level than before. One that could never be truly measured. She explained for him dutifully. And once you've accomplished this, all that's left is for you to control it, and then push it and your soul out to the surface like you would your inner power. If you can manage that without a problem, your ascension will fully take effect, and become complete. That sounds like it could be a little tricky. Beerus commented after hearing her explanation. Something that earned him a small chuckle from the heavily endowed goddess. Little tricky, is putting it lightly. As I said before, it's without question the most difficult stage to get over. Plenty of things could go wrong and cause you to fail, forcing you to start the process from scratch all over again, no matter how close you may have been on the latest attempt. It's something that takes an absolute level of precision and focus, leaving no room for even the tiniest of mistakes. Unfolding her arms, she let her gigantic globes bounce down with a healthy jiggle, as she mounted one hand on her hip. Her expression turning completely serious as she met his eyes. For this reason, it also takes the longest amount of time to master. That being usually about 10 years at minimum. 10 years at a minimum, huh? Not the longest he'd gone to master something by any stretch. Hell, he'd trained on and off for Ultra Instinct for an eon, and had only managed to gain a limited degree of the divine technique. Compared to that level of patience despite his usual proclivities, a decade for him would have been nothing. And yet even still, he had a feeling he could master it in even less time. And with the blade theoretically, at least until he tested it for himself, he could leapfrog over that required training time and attain it now, if it was needed. However, he couldn't help but feel that attaining it that way, if it was indeed possible, may well come with some caveats. This was a sentiment Gia seemed to share as well, as though reading his mind, as she gave him a cautious look of warning. Be wary about attaining your ascended state through the sword's help, if it is indeed possible, Beerus. Achieving it in such a fashion without most of the groundwork laid is unheard of, and could very well come with consequences for doing so. Like perhaps your time in it being limited, or perhaps your spirit being unable to harness its might to the fullest at your current level, forcing you to settle for now at but a fraction of its real power. Or worse, because you used the sword's help to pull it off, having it be separated from your person, even for a minuscule amount of time, could immediately pull you out of the true divine form entirely. Beerus ignored the wobble of her breasts as she laid her other hand on his shoulder, giving him an even stronger gaze of warning. Please be aware of these potential faults, Beerus. Testing this out during training is all well and good, and I'd recommend doing so soon because of your current safety. As if by chance, you end up getting put in an all-or-nothing battle well before you get through the second and third stages of your training properly, then you'll most likely be forced to rely on this little loophole for actual combat. And if you don't know what the flaws are of this possible method beforehand, and don't take heed of them, then what could be your saving grace may just turn into little more than a way to stall your own defeat. Back to present. My apologies, Gia, but it would seem I'm going to have to go in somewhat blind for this after all. Shame this moronic son of yours couldn't have waited a little longer before invading us, or even better again, not have been brazen enough to force his way in here and challenge us by himself. Beerus thought with some bit of morbid amusement at the situation, as he stood back and began to focus on himself and his domain while the others charged forth to aid Styx and Themis. Because I don't care how difficult this process may be to accomplish as I am now. I'll coax my true divine form out no matter what, and once I do, I'm going to teach this bastard child of yours a lesson in what happens to those who choose to earn the wrath of the god of destruction. HMPH. How annoying. Meanwhile, as Beerus began his attempt at ascension, Hyperion, unknowing of this happening, suddenly appeared between the two goddesses getting in his way, and swung his arms out at blistering speeds too quick and close by for his adversaries to dodge. Heavenly light arcing out from his swinging limbs like waves of dense energy, colliding with both as they just managed to bring their arms up to block some of the attack as they were both pushed back in opposite directions. Their feet digging into the ground as they both grunted and made to grind themselves to a halt. However, Hyperion had no intention of giving either that kind of time to recover, as his body suddenly appeared before Styx instantaneously and all but drilled his foot into her abdomen with a brutal kick. One that blasted a huge shockwave out behind her, and made her wince from the pain as her body bent over. Then, in the same instant, he was suddenly right by Themis a good few hundred meters away, and snapping her head to the side with a heavy punch to her exposed cheek, which produced a similarly strong shockwave blasted out from around her features. Themis tried to retaliate with a punch of her own, but Hyperion vanished from in front of her, appearing before Styx in no time flat, smashing his knee in a devastating jump kick straight to her face, sending droplets of ichor flying from her crushed nose as her head snapped back. She would have charged in to help her ally, were it not for her brother appearing in that same instant he'd just delivered such a brutal blow. The Titan of Heavenly Light giving his sister no time to react again as his swung up with a fist and delivered a swift, but powerful uppercut to her chin that not only rattled her divine skull a bit as it clattered her teeth together, but also knocked her feet up from the ground. Something he took advantage of immediately as she was briefly dazed, latching onto her ankles and spinning her around faster than any tornado, as their forms blurred round and round like one. The dazzling colors of their ascended states as they spun forming a visible, mighty vortex of the various, mesmerizing shades, before he launched her at breakneck speeds towards Styx, who'd only just recovered from the latest blow she'd received. Seeing her ally whiz towards her, her immediate thought was to dodge out of the way and trust in Themis to right herself or recover quickly from an impending crash. This wasn't meant to be, however, as pain suddenly flared throughout her back, as her body bent backwards. A brief, fleeting glance backward revealing Hyperion, who'd appeared behind her this time, bashing the soles of his feet into her spine with a damaging dropkick. One that sent her body flying forward against her will before she knew it, sending her on a collision course with the fast approaching body of Themis, whose head in particular looked poised to plow into her gut as hard as a divine spear's tip. Fortunately for them, and unfortunately for Hyperion, the duo never ended up collided, as 7 additional, intense pressures suddenly burst forth from nearby, before 2 colorful blurs whizzed in. The 2 blurs somehow managing to catch and break the momentum of the 2 goddesses, as they skidded forward. Hyperion himself being given no time at that juncture to chase, as his divine instincts kicked in yet again, and allowed him to narrowly avoid another kick, moving at insane speeds towards his head by ducking and then leaping away from his newest adversary. What his eyes landed on was Metis, now in her own true divine form. Her intensely iridescent, turquoise eyes blaring at him with a powerful glare, as the rest of curvy, once pale body glowed a lighter shade of watery-looking blue, with it occasionally rippling lightly, similar to Styx's ascended form, like disturbed waters, with her tunic nowhere to be seen. Her hair holding the same beatific, radiant shade as her eyes, holding aloft and waving about behind her just as seamlessly as her sister's too, defying gravity by acting as though she was currently submerged beneath water. Her modestly large D-cup breasts and nether regions covered over by magic, just like her fellow goddesses. This didn't mean he was in the clear though at that moment though, as he was accosted by attacks from multiple angles the instant he came to a stop. His body being forced to bob and weave away from the heavy blows, both high-speed punches and kicks, raining in from several angles, with blurred colors of violent, almost overpowering red of slightly different shades. One identical to the color of human blood from Beerus's previous universe, while the other was closer to a ruby red. After managing to avoid the flurry, he made his body phase out of existence just as 2 feet, one a vibrant green and the other being the brightest shade of crimson with a hint of black, came crashing down where his head had been. HMPH. First the nymph, and now you 4 as well. And here I thought you lot were too afraid to come at me together. Hyperion sneered, not worried in the least as the children of Styx now stood in front of Metis in some kind of formation, all turned towards and glaring balefully at him in their true divine forms as well. With the one thing they all truly shared, other than hostility toward him, being that each of their wings were now lit up a dazzling white behind them to play off what the rest of their bodies had become. Kratos was the one whose body had mainly turned a dark shade of bloody red, with his 8-foot frame still maintaining all the bulk he'd had before and then some, as his tunic had been shed out of existence. Countless veins seemingly protruding from his dark red, glowing body of muscle from head to toe, which contrasted wondrously, and quite intimidatingly against the red of his form, by being a more muted, but still luminescent greenish blue. Almost as if giving the impression that an overwhelming strength was being held back with every fiber of his being, with his huge muscles looking ready to burst from having it all compressed into him, as his genitals were hidden away by magic. His once dark eyes having turned into a scarlet red mixed with hints of blue and green to match the rest of them, and bored into the titan of heavenly light with a desire to crush him into paste. Bea's shapely, athletic form had gone ruby red with her C-cup mounds jutting out proudly with the absence of her tunic, but still covered over by magic like her groin area, whilst her hair had turned the same shade as her body, swaying wildly around her to match her current mood of fury. A misty miasma floating off her glowing frame in several different shades of red, both light and dark, as though there was something inside her that was trying to forcefully push its way out of her. Like her brother, her eyes were glowing a scarlet red, but did without the hints of green and blue. Instead, the glow of her eyes was seeping out further than anyone else's, with the same misty miasma as the rest of her hourglass figure, as they held nothing but malentent for the Son of Heaven and Earth. Zelus's more sleek but still muscular body was now radiant with the brightest shade of red compared to his brother and sister as opposed to his more ghostly pale appearance prior, almost bordering on turning pink even. Like his siblings and everyone else, his private parts were covered over by magic from view. His hair becoming curled up at its ends and waving about in numerous strands behind and even above him, as it turned a more orange-red in its glow-white color. His eyes, however, were the deepest kind of crimson imaginable, radiating a level of unimaginable passion as something seemed to swirl around in his brightly glowing sclera. Not in any loving or romantic way though. Not even close. His evoked more of the passion one would feel for getting to defeat or even decimate their enemies that stood before them. And right now, there was only one enemy before him. Finally, there was Nike, who, unlike the rest of her siblings, had her once pale, lithe and athletically supple body now glimmering green almost as vibrantly as Gia's eyes. D-cup breasts alongside the erogenous area between her legs coated over, again, by magic as her eyes blazed with a darker green mixed in with a hint of brown, almost forming the pattern of a palm branch in her sclera. A radiant crown forming itself out of nowhere over her head in the appearance of one made out of said same branch. The leaves, of which lightly waving about over her temple, whilst her once long, brown hair that curled and became wavier near the bottom shifted into the colors of the palm branch as well. Certain strands being pure, shining brown while the rest became frayed, with the patterns that the rest of her hair formed almost resembling palm leaves poking out from their stalks, glittering an incandescent green as it fell by her back still. Her presence alone giving off the air of victory which spread out from her in waves, falling over her allies and give their forms a very brief, greenish glow on their outline, effectively passing on her spirit, in a sense, unto all of them in what one could construe as a blessing. This mattered nil to the Titan god, however. The weak goddess could give as many blessings to her allies as she pleased. It would not help them against him. I think we've allowed you to run amok in our inner sanctum enough, Hyperion. Metis said calmly, her voice coming out somewhat distorted as she met his annoyed gaze. Allowed me. HMPH. Once again, just like Themis and Styx, you make it sound like you have any ability to stop me. He scoffed, raising a hand and pointing it at her as heavenly light began to rapidly come together by his palm in what looked to be the form of a sphere. Yet another fool who thinks of themselves more capable than they actually are. This, coming from the one who thought it was a good idea to invade a fortified base of his fellow deities by himself. The distorted voice of Prometheus snorted, drawing the Titan of heavenly light's attention to him, as he and his brother lowered the two goddesses they'd stopped from collided harshly to the ground gently. The Titan of Foresight's eyes glowed radiantly with a stunning gold almost as eye-catching as Hyperion's, whilst his brother Epimetheus near him held a more dark amber shade. Both clearly also in their ascended states, as the rest of their muscular bodies had shifted in color, with the former's being a fiery gold with what looked to be divine flames licking off from around his shoulders and having replaced both his beard and his hair. His tunic having been practically incinerated away as an intense heat radiated off of not just the flames, but his whole body, with his genitalia being covered up entirely by another patch of holy fire that trickled over his thighs and licked off by his sides. The latter's body glowed a darker gold than his brother's, almost dim in a way, as his genitals were covered over by magic. Without any fancy effect like his brother's flames, whilst his hair floated upward and spiked up slightly, almost looking like a super saiyan's as it glowed a brighter, shinier gold than the rest of him. Thanks for the assist. Styx said graciously with a small smile. One mirrored by Themis, as the two now stood side by side with the brothers. No problem. Epimetheus replied back for both his brother and himself, accepting the gratitude for what it was. Hyperion sneered down at him, more amused than anything else by Prometheus's words. The difference there is, unlike you, I can more than handle the opposition. Even in your true divine forms, with all of my abilities taken into account, you might as well be nothing more than irritating fodder at best. Redirecting his hand toward him, Hyperion was about to fire a concentrated blast when his body suddenly stilled. And it wasn't just him either, everyone else around him to some degree did so too, as an unbelievably dark, oppressive aura suddenly slammed down throughout Olympus. One that made even the pure air provided by ether chill to the point even those in their ascended states felt the divine equivalent of a cold sweat coming on. A presence, one eldritch and most foul, suddenly spiking up a well of fear that clawed at Hyperion's being in an instant, and making his attack fizzle away out of his command. You really do talk too much, you know that. Hades' voice growled from behind the floating titan, causing said deity to whip his head around to where the voice had come from, as a horrifying, miasmic aura suddenly spread out over the peak of Mount Olympus. And what Hyperion saw once he turned around was nothing. Absolutely nothing other than the miasmic aura that came out in waves and fell over him, making his divine skin crawl as goosebumps cropped up over his body. His glowing eyes wide as he stared straight where the source should have been coming from, but saw nothing other than the long stretch of land going up to the barrier encompassing the mountain's peak. Something that was a mistake, as doing so somehow only amplified the sudden bout of fear he felt even more, as though he was looking towards something that shouldn't be. An unseeable abomination of nature that held a sense of unholy wrongness to it that had the Titan of heavenly light, for a brief period, totally paralyzed. Unable to comprehend that which his gaze was somehow failing to see. For the first time in his immortal life, his eyes, which could pierce through the veil and see through just about anything, were at a loss. Something that should have been impossible. I think it's about time you got shut up. The fledgling deity's voice remarked, suddenly much closer to Hyperion than it had been before. Too close to be anywhere other than within breathing distance of his physical form. And sir, the Titan struck out with a fast and heavy punch, pushing down and resisting the paralyzing fear being brought on by the foul aura. Instead of striking home on an enemy though, he hit nothing but air. Despite the fact that every fiber of his being was screaming at him that his current adversary, the source of the aura, was exactly where he'd attacked. What the hung? Hyperion, while not hurt in the slightest, was indeed more than caught off guard once he felt something smack against the side of his head and produce a shockwave as it snapped it in said direction thanks to his stupor. Was it a punch? A kick? A headbutt? He couldn't tell due to his foe's invisibility that he somehow couldn't see through, and that inability of his to know, even with the aid of his heavenly light, was what really jarred him there as he stumbled briefly in the air. Because under any other circumstance, the Titan would have laughed at the force behind the blow itself, as his opponent was so laughably weak still compared to him that such an action would have been little more than a terrible joke. Yet now though, he found himself instead, more befuddled than he'd ever been, as he tried to recover from the shock of being unable to see or even touch his opponent for the first time in his unending life. It was in this small window of time where he was left stunned mentally, that everyone saw an opportunity they didn't have prior, now that their enemy was completely open and not paying attention to any of them. A silent signal seeming to be sent towards all of them in that instant which Hades, whom none of them could see either, had afforded them, which pushed them to go on the offensive immediately. The first to push the initiative were the children of Styx. And like sharks that smelled blood in the water, they were on him in a flash as one. The first was Kratos, who zoomed in with a barbarous punch straight into the gut. One that sent an immense shockwave barreling out through his opponent's back as his fist buried itself down to the elbow inside the Titan's glowing abdomen with a ghastly crunch that knocked both air and spittle infused with ichor out of Hyperion's open maw as the rest of him bent over into the punch with a pained grimace. His head was then grabbed on either side by Bea's hands. said Goddess, letting a feral grin cross her features as she drove her knee up with all the force she could muster right into his face at mind-numbing speeds, which forced his eyes to close as the blow flattened his divine nose into his face and sent twin sprinkles of ichor flying out of his crushed nostrils. But she wasn't done there. Just as soon as her initial leg swung down, her other leg swung up and cracked him just as hard with its knee, further caving his face in as she let his head go, snapping back from the force of her second brutal blow. It was then that Kratos yanked his fist back with a harsh twist from the Titan's punctured midsection, showing a mostly healed up hole with part of the Titan's divine innards showing and leaking their ichor out, as Zealous rushed forth. A sharp forearm slamming across the first-generation Titan's forehead, partially indenting it, as he used the momentum to twirl himself around midair while tucking in his wings, and come back in for a spinning back elbow directly unto Hyperion's left eye. His attack garnering a garbled noise of pain from the Titan as his head was knocked back again. Nike had soared above him in that instant, and while his bludgeoned face was upturned and mending itself from prior damage, groaning slightly from the pain inflicted, she pulled her knees up to her chest before shunting them and herself right back down. A loud vroom sounding off as the back of his impacted against the ground, shaking the mountain as a deep crater formed beneath him, about 10 meters wide and deep. She then took flight off of him with a jump that sent sprinkles of ichor flying up from a clearly mashed face, as the rest of his body remained upturned with feet sticking up high in the air. And Metis was on him then, just as quick to capitalize on the heavenly Titan's current status before he could recover his bearings. Her body whizzing into existence and grabbing his ankles before they could fall, and then spinning on her heels, torquing her body around at 180 degrees to tug him free from the ground while using her own forward momentum to spin him upright and into the air. Whilst his body was afloat, and his awareness lacking, the consort of Zeus showed a vindictive smile as her shapely body twisted round again before arcing one of her curvy legs up in a side kick and smashing her foot into the airborne Hyperion's exposed face before he could try to put up a guard. A deafening kraak resounding throughout the area, as her vengeful kick to pay him back for his one earlier sent his body zooming away with a shattered nose again, along with a few divine teeth that continued to glow as radiantly as he did even after being dislodged in a bloody spurt. His body was a blur as it sailed forward in that precious fraction of an instant, latest wounds steadily healing as he rocketed towards the sons of Iapetus, Themis and Styx. The former of which leaping away for the moment, a silent message of understanding passed between the four already, as Hyperion's body rapidly approached. The two goddesses giving each other a brief look and nod, as they moved a bit further back from each other while paying full attention to the trajectory of their enemy's flying frame. A spark then appearing in both the glowing eyes, aura pushing out of the divine, hourglass figures as Themis tucked her sword back in one hand while clenching the other, Styx doing the same, as the former's brother came close. The two then pushed forward right as his head came into the gap between them. The dainty fists being reared back, channeling as much of the divine power into them as they could, to the point where they radiated much more intensely than the rest of their bodies. They both then planted their feet on the ground, breaking apart and cratering it beneath them as they leaned in, putting all of their weight into it as both thrusted their punch forward at the same time, in perfect sync with the other. A stupendously blaring shockwave rang out, quaking the mountain down its foundations and beyond as they struck home on either side of his face. The sickening sound of bones cracking and breaking apart following suit as their knuckles crushed into his cheeks, shattering all of his teeth as both sides of his jaw caved into one another with a gory spurt of ichor. The force from the combined attack traveling throughout the rest of his head, and sending cracks across nearly every inch of his skull. Divine, glowing brain matter seeping out from almost every orifice as his legs swung out limply behind him, before coming back down with the front of his feet scraping across the ruined ground before coming to a halt with his knees bent. His spasmodically twitching body clearly only held up by the two goddesses' fists plowed into his face. Said duo unable to help the vengeful smiles at finally being able to bash the arrogant Titan's head in. Especially Styx, whose expression was positively aglow with glee, like she'd just settled a grudge with someone in the most satisfying way imaginable. Not so fun when it's you getting the beat down, now is it? She quipped viciously, taking great pleasure in the small, pitiful sounds of agony that Hyperion was able to make in his current state, before she and Themis, who also took satisfaction in shutting him up the hard way, pulled their fists back from his thoroughly messed up features. Strings of ichor clinging to their knuckles as they did, before peeling off as soon as their hands were far enough away. Before Hyperion could even be given the chance to fall to the ground, Prometheus and Epimetheus reappeared right in front of him. Both second-generation Titans leaning back with a knee up to their chests, cocking a leg back each as they both gave the healing Hyperion an amused smirk. No words being said by either, as they shot their foots in and smashed them hard into the Titan's chest, rattling and cracking the bones within as the power behind the dual kick sent him flying away helplessly. His body eventually impacting against the barrier on the far end with another hefty shockwave as his arms and legs splayed out like a starfish. The crackle of thunder then echoed throughout all of Olympus from up high near the edge of the barrier. An exceptionally strong blue light greater than any flash of lightning in the sky shadowing over everyone then, as the muscular figure of Zeus with his new thunderbolt prepped appeared up above. Electricity burning through his glowing blue eyes as he glared down at the currently unmoving Titan with nothing but wrath, with what seemed like the sky itself rumbling with his power. A bit of a distance behind them, what sounded like the whistling of wind as waves crashed together echoed as well, at a similar level to the thunder. An incredibly bright sea green light comparable in luminosity and producing a similar effect shadowing over the rest present falling over, and almost melding together with the blue as the earth beneath everyone's feet quaked, as though compelled to, by the will of the god who conjured up his own mighty aura. The figure of Poseidon standing tall and firm at the light and quaking earth's epicenter, with deeply glowing green eyes that equaled the ferocity found in Zeus's, as his trident was prepped for one big attack. Have a little taste of this while you're at it. Both Zeus and Poseidon roared out. Their auras flexing and flaring higher than ever thanks to his symbols of power's influence, with their eyes glow deepening further, appearing brighter than the aura that encompassed the rest of their forms. Veins pulsating around their bodies as they clutched their mighty weapons forged by the Cyclopes with all their might above their heads, pulling all the power they could muster with the weapon's help into it. They both then set them loose at the exact same time, Zeus's hurled from the sky and dive bombing towards its prey at speeds and power far beyond what Zeus himself had ever touched thus far. And likewise, the trident was thrust forward at an equal velocity and force that Poseidon himself was far from capable of producing prior. The latter spun as it sailed forward, rotating so fast it appeared to form a mini tornado-like drill around itself made almost entirely of beatific water that looked plucked straight from the boundless ocean itself, which swelled rapidly and savagely. Not unlike the whirling depths of a whirlpool that sought to suck anything trapped in it deep into the sea's endless depths, tipped with violent, splashing waves that on a grander scale, which wouldn't have looked out of place on crashing tidal waves. And as both approached their unmoving enemy, the thunderbolt seemed to twirl around the swirling drill of watery death and merge with it, producing an all-new attack that combined the power of the two together. The resultant fusion of lightning and water, sky and sea, exponentially amplifying the other to even more absurd degrees than were already achieved, and becoming the perfect storm as one. To the eyes and ears of a still not fully recovered Hyperion, that is what he heard and saw. An oncoming storm that had already reached him by the time his cognitive faculties had reasonably recovered, and by then, it was too late for him to do anything. The fusion attack struck him dead in the chest with a THOOM, as a heart-pounding, awe-inspiring explosion came shortly thereafter. One that from an outside perspective, covered more than a kilometer around where the detonation had occurred, and shook the very foundations of Mount Olympus on a similar vein to what those in their true divine forms had individually accomplished. Creating an almost surreal earthquake and gale force winds that buffeted against the other gods and lesser deities still atop the magically enhanced mountain. But the outward perspective did not do the combined attack's power justice. For within said explosion, felt only by the immobile titan of heavenly light, was a condensed destructive power great enough to eradicate Beerus's old universe numerous times over. Following such a detonation, Zeus and Poseidon were quick to will their weapons back into hand as soon as the former landed back down, side by side with his consort Metis, who gave him a brief, but amused look at his theatrics. The lull in the fighting was exceedingly brief though, only lasting for a scant moment as they all peered into the cloud of dust that had formed from the impact of the brother combo move. The aggressive call of, "Let's keep up the pressure," being heard from Bia, as she and the other children of Styx were quick to take flight and rush to where the Titan had been downed. "If we keep up this pace, we can take this bastard out here and now," the goddess of force shouted out ruthlessly to the other gods she and her siblings left behind in their charge. "She's right, you know," Prometheus remarked loudly for the rest to hear, with a smirk dancing over his features. The architect of mankind recognizing what the forespawn of Styx saw in this moment, which was their chance to potentially finish their enemy early, without requiring Beerus to do whatever he was attempting that may not even work. "This is a perfect opportunity to take him out that we might not get again. If we act quick, we likely won't even need Beer," the Titan of Foresight's words cut off as his glowing eyes flashed a brighter gold than they had yet in that instant. And as soon as they did, those remaining around him quickly saw his smirk vanish as he went stock still, before an unmistakably alarmed expression took over his features. Styx, more than anyone, was about to ask why, but never got the chance. "You four. Pull back. Pull back right now." Prometheus then suddenly yelled out with an outstretched arm, his distorted voice only just reaching the four children of Styx's ears as they got close to the dust cloud. His warning came a little too late though, as from the cloud of dust, two glaring eyes of white gold, glowing rage peered through. And it wasn't long after before a roar or power was let out, and with it, a massive wall of heavenly light being projected out all around where the Titan had been smashed into, rushing straight into the four deities before they had the chance to kill their momentum, or even throw up a guard to defend themselves. It hit them dead on with an absurd amount of force, bashing them all hard enough to send the four-winged deities rocketing back in the opposite direction they'd been heading at blistering speeds. The four appearing like colorful blurs to those watching as they collided with and crashed through the palace walls, sending down yet more debris in the process and leaving the previously majestic building a further perforated and tattered mess. "Children." Styx whirled her head around to where they'd been launched with concern, before her expression became furious as she turned her attention back to the one responsible. The wall of light he'd used to smack them back having dissipated into particles just as soon as the Titan's assailants had been thrust away from him. "Ugh. You think you can take me out that easily?" Hyperion growled, distorted voice full of guttural rage and offense. His bright light that emanated from his body seeming to grow in blinding luminosity the angrier he got, making it hard for even those ascended to look at him, and impossible for those who hadn't, as they had to bring a hand up to their faces to somewhat block the intrusive, divine light that was blasting their retinas. You dare to insult me with your delusions just because you got to blindside me. Floating up high into the air, Hyperion's glowing teeth grit down with enough pressure to crush atoms as he snarled at those below him with contempt. His injuries having fully healed at this point as a massive orb of light rapidly took shape above his head. One that cast a massive shadow over everything below, as it grew bigger and bigger still, eventually dwarfing even Hyperion's usual size 100 times over. Its luminosity overwhelming that of his own body and auras, as it forced even the ascended gods to either squint or place a hand between the cascading light and their eyes due to how inconceivably bright it was. Damn! Styx grimaced hard, cursing under her breath as she recalled this particular attack from when he'd used it on him in his normal state while chasing her and Beerus. And how difficult it had been to avoid without teleportation back then in what was sure to be a neutered state compared to this one. Everyone, you better get ready. She called out, grabbing everyone's attention. I've seen this attack before with Beerus. You saw but only a pitiful version of the real thing. Hyperion bellowed, cutting her off. What you dealt with was my attack in its most basic form. Something barely even in its infancy compared to the one I'm about to unleash on you. The sphere of concentrated heavenly light above him finally stopped growing in size, as it pressed against the barrier behind him at a swollen size of over 1 kilometer. Positively radiating a sense of dread through its blinding luminescence. Go ahead and try to attack me now, if you wish. He all but stared straight at the ruined palace, where the 4 children of Styx had burst up from and flown into the air with vengeance clear on their faces. And then where the repulsive aura that had helped in flabbergasting him before was, all but staring right into Hade's invisible eyes. It won't stop me from reappearing wherever I wish to avoid it. And to whomever of you is the one who escapes my sight, I assure you, that little trick of yours won't work in stunning me a second time. Sisters, I really don't like where this is going, Hestia murmured with deep worry, far away from the action with Hera and Demeter, as like their brothers, the sisters were forced to hold a hand over their eyes to stop the Titan's illuminating light from blinding them. I can't explain it, but I can't help but feel a great and terrible disturbance coming from Hyperion and his attack. She bit her lip, uncertain as to if whether or not she should do something now, despite what had been said to her prior, as the shiver that was currently going up and down her body just from being in the presence of what Hyperion was setting up drew out a serious amount of apprehension from her. I'm sure they'll be fine, Hestia. Hera spoke softly to her sister, with Demeter nodding in agreement as both she and her placed a hand atop the eldest sibling's shoulders in comfort. The former not caring in the moment how doing such exposed her nether regions, as being there to ease her eldest sister's clear worry and apprehension at the current situation was more important than her own modesty. No matter what he's about to throw at them, they should be able to handle it until the time is right. Provided that whatever our dear brother has in mind will work, of course. The trio of gorgeous goddesses briefly turned their attention over to Beerus right next to them, who hadn't so much as moved a muscle since he'd raised up that new sword of his. The purple-haired deity looking to be in a state of deep, meditative focus the likes of which put the meditation they'd watched him do in their father's repulsive stomach to shame, as a dark purple sheen of aura coated over his and the sword's forms. I'm sure he will. Demeter grinned, despite the current situation drawing some apprehension from her as well, and no doubt for Hera too, even though she put on a brave face. Beerus has yet to let us down when it's counted, and I doubt he's gonna start now. HMPH. I suppose I can't argue with that, Hera surprisingly replied earnestly, without a lick of her usual sass or attitude, as she let a small grin of her own touch her features. For as much as she and him jousted with each other verbally, and in some other ways too, there was no way she could deny that he'd always got the job done, and had serious doubts he was about to start flubbing it now of all times. Hestia managed a small smile despite her mounting apprehension as she gazed at her twin's lustrous, still form. One that made her feel a wad of hope in all the growing anxiety she was getting from their Titan enemy's presence. Yes, I guess we'll all have to put our faith in him like we have before, and he'll no doubt come through for us once again. She then turned her attention back to the others, doing her best to keep the light blocked out enough from her glowing pools to avoid blindness. As I'm sure they'll find a way to keep him at bay, no matter what he's about to pull out. I'm done dragging this out. The Titan up above said, cracking his neck whilst massaging his previously broken face with the deepest scowl of disdain he'd possibly ever worn, as he outstretched a hand down to those below him. His blazing eyes beginning to match the ferocity of the sphere's intense, overbearing light of the heavens, as it began to warp ominously. No more messing around. It's high time I dealt with you irksome fools. TCH. Oh yeah. Poseidon barked back truculently, readying his trident again by his side and pointing it defiantly up at the Titan, even if he had to close his eyes due to the blinding light bearing down on him. Go ahead and do your worst, you arrogant, bloviating stooge. Narrowing his eyes sharply at the gall of the fledgling deity, Hyperion's form became shadowed over, with only his menacingly glowing pools visible anymore to the ascended gods below. As you wish, worm. Everybody tensed, as the sphere spasmed one more time, letting out what sounded like a brief whistle in the wind. And then, like the trigger of a gun being pulled, countless beams of heavenly light shot forth from all around the orb right towards them, and even the ascended gods widened their eyes when they managed to make out the immense speed of them. Moving faster than any attack Hyperion had yet launched, far too quick for any non-ascended deity to even hope of perceiving, and almost fast enough to be like a blur to those that were. Just about everyone cursed under their breath, as they readied themselves for the oncoming onslaught of destructive blasts. Prometheus's eyes glowing greater as he made use of his future vision to predict what was going to happen ahead. And as soon as he did, and saw what was coming, his radiating eyes widened greatly in grave alarm. Everyone. Scatter now. He roared loudly, more so to those near him, as he leapt away without waiting for a response. Then again, he didn't need one, as the others followed suit immediately along with him, leaping back in varying directions because of his warning, as they knew better than to ignore the god who could peer into the future. Zeus and Poseidon in particular due to their inferior reaction time being helped, as Metis grabbed her consort's hand while moving away, whilst Themis turned and all but dove toward the trident-wielding god to push him away with her. No sooner had they all done leapt away, did a massive beam of heavenly light about 1/2 kilometer in diameter shoot down from above and plow into the space they'd all previously occupied. The pillar of divine light blasting through the ground and creating quite the deep perforation that traveled hundreds of kilometers deep despite the insane magical durability that Olympus possessed. The outward force of it alone being enough to blast any stray nymphs that weren't already at the outer reaches of the mountain's peak far away, and slamming so harshly against the barrier that their bodies immediately turned to bloody mush before they could even have a chance to scream. None of the gods who were actually fighting against Hyperion had any time to think on what had just happened, before the uncountable barrage of light beams came in each of the directions. Just about every one of them Zeus and Poseidon threw up the best guard they could, and took to running and dodging every blast they could while being forced to block or destroy the ones that they couldn't. Which included ones they'd already previously evaded. A task especially difficult for Themis and Metis, as they'd both made it their mission to protect the non-ascended brother gods from being blasted to pieces. As while they wouldn't necessarily have to worry about being knocked out for far longer like they would for taking too much accumulated damage, none of them would put it past Hyperion to keep blasts raining down on them even when their physical bodies were nothing but paste. Just so they'd be ensured to stay down rather than try to annoy him further. Be careful everyone. Styx called out to everyone in warning, as she took to using her raw power to smash and block the blasts heading for her more often than attempting to avoid them. These attacks don't stop once they miss you the first time. They'll keep coming at you until they land, so try your best to get rid of them rather than avoid them. Everyone other than Zeus and Poseidon who couldn't react to them regardless gave a motion of acknowledgement and thanks for the information which had become more than apparent to them already. Styx, Spawn in particular who were zipping and gliding through the air to avoid as many as possible initially taking to their mother's advice more than anyone, as they began rapidly punching and kicking against the oncoming blasts to either deflect them into others or outright smash through them. Even getting close and covering for one of their siblings if they felt they needed to, whereas the rest down below were more so relying upon themselves individually to handle the assault, due to being more spread out. A task that, while difficult due to the sheer volume of blasts heading for all of them individually, was proving to be a fairly viable way of handling the situation. HMPH. Don't be getting too confident now. Hyperion remarked from up above, as a blast of light suddenly peered out from behind Styx just as she'd swiped her arms out while projecting her power through in an invisible arc, smacking away and destroying a deluge of blasts closing in on her front. For you have yet to deal with the true terror of this attack. Styx turned upon recognizing the presence of an attack that had somehow gotten behind her and made to swipe for it, only to catch a strong glimmer out of the corner of her eye as yet more blasts appeared right by her now turned back from thin air. She was only given the time to widen her eyes in shock at this before she was ruthlessly pelted by dozens upon dozens of light-based attacks that wrenched out a gasp of pain from her as they flung her forward and into the blast she'd been attempting swipe away as it slammed into her face. The force of it messing up her divine features as it snapped her head back and disoriented her further, making her easy prey for the volley of blasts raining down from above like a meteor shower. Mother! Her 4 children cried out, sensing the danger their parent was in with the hail of blasts raining down on her as they threw caution to the wind and barreled toward her as fast as they could. Each covering for the other as more and more blasts assailed them and tried to intercept them, smacking and bashing them out of the way as they tried to reach her, but they were too far away to get to her in time, as the rain of light blasts were already mere inches away from contact. Whilst the 4 wing-bearing deities were unable to make it to the stunned and vulnerable goddess in time, Prometheus was not. The Titan of Foresight's flaming body charging in whilst choosing to avoid his own latest bombardment rather than deal with it right away, as he managed to make it to Styx just in time. His arms spreading out from him just as he'd gotten right in front of her staggered frame and projecting out a massive dome of divine fire around them which smashed up against the hail of beams raining down from above and to their sides. The barrier of sorts deflecting some and snuffing others out as it kept both of them insulated and protected from hail of heavenly light carrying malintent. Ugh, it looks like I'll have to thank you for another timely save, Prometheus. The goddess gave a thankful nod, recovering from her brief stupor and standing upright by her flame-bodied ally as the multitude of light beams continued to pelt down all over his barrier. I should try not to make a habit of letting that happen. It's rather unbecoming of me. You can find a way to pay me back later, he grunted with a light grin, before his face showed a grimace with increasing strain as more and more blasts smashed down all around his erected dome of divine fire. The sheer amount of effort it took for him to keep all of the attacks at bay being clear as day to the Oceanid with each passing fraction of a second. For now, though, we need to prepare ourselves. Because this attack of his is only about to get worse. Before Styx could properly respond to this, she noticed that same glimmer of ominous light from before out of the corner of her eye. And it was purely through divine instinct that she was able to thrust her hand out in time, and send a pulse of her power to obliterate the several-foot-large light blast that materialized within the barrier itself barely half a meter away from them. Damn him. He can make his attacks appear from anywhere his heavenly light is, just as he can do for himself physically, the eldest Oceanid cursed yet again under her breath, swiping a hand out around her to deal with several more irksome blasts that proved her hypothesis by simply materializing out of thin air, or rather, through the mist of heavenly light Hyperion had conjured up earlier, to get at them. Yep. Quite the vexing attack to deal with. Prometheus remarked in agreement with her aggravated sentiment. Her time to pay him back coming quite fast whilst inside the barrier by either swiping or pointing her hands out to continue getting rid of the blasts appearing inside as they came before they could do any damage, as he went on. Our only solace for it is that due to our own divine auras most likely, they have to appear a very short distance away from us rather than just on us immediately, which gives us the time we need to react to them provided we can notice the signs of their appearance. It's not much, but it is some small relief, because if not for that, I'm pretty sure we'd all have been defeated by now. He groaned, struggling to keep his shield of fire up around them from the outer attacks which were far greater in number than that which could appear inside of the fiery barrier with them. I'd imagine that this could be mitigated if we could manage to fully disrupt his focus, but given the bombardment he's throwing at us, along with his ability to just appear wherever he wants within his heavenly light, I'm not sure that's really possible. What if we enlist Hades' assistance again? Would that work in helping us curtail this insufferable onslaught? Prometheus was quick to shoot the goddess' suggestion down, as she did what she could to defend them both from the intruding blast attacks. Whilst Hades' helm is going to keep him safe, going off what I saw earlier, he's not going to be stunning Hyperion again like he did before for a counterattack. Hyperion somewhat knows what to expect with him now, so that trick of his isn't going to work twice. Our foe is arrogant, but in no way stupid enough to be befuddled by the same gimmick twice, even if he has no idea as to how Hades is pulling it off. So, then what do we do? The female deity couldn't help but ask with a small air of exasperation leaking through whilst destroying another handful of blasts that appeared by their side and above them, as being totally at Hyperion's mercy yet again was not a feeling she enjoyed. I have no doubt the others have figured out by now the trick he can pull with his layer of heavenly light, but such information means precious little if none of us have a plan to disrupt his tempo. As she said this, she swung her arm around and pulsed her power to deal with another half-dozen blasts that appeared all at once at about a quarter of the size of the first one she dealt with. Her eyes able to peer through the veil of godly fire partially protecting them from the more voluminous volley bashing against the fiery walls and see how the others were faring. Which wasn't all that much better than they were. Her children did the best to whiz through the air, evading and destroying the litany of light beams as they hurtled towards them, but even with their teamwork it was clearly becoming hard for them to do so. the occasional blast actually managing to get through the combined guard and crash into varying sections of their ascended forms, which briefly disoriented them and forced the others to work overtime to cover for their sibling dutifully until they recovered enough to get back into the swing of things, helping the others out. Epimetheus had at some point joined up with Themis, and was helping her to deal with the shower of light blasts rushing in on her, Poseidon, and himself, particularly with those appearing at awkward angles from the layer of heavenly light all around them. All whilst Themis swung her sword out and cut down the rest that threatened to pummel them into the ground. Even then though, like with her children, there was clearly the occasional blast slipping through, if the pained expressions that all three showed, along with the chunk of Poseidon's shoulder being missing, were any indication, as they fought back as good as they could. Metis was perhaps getting the worst of it from the looks of things though, and Styx could only grimace at her sister's pain, as she was left alone to guard herself and Zeus out in the open. The latter missing a chunk of both his left leg and his shoulder, with his tunic having been ripped off at some point leaving his full torso bare, and the eldest Oceane didn't doubt he may have been plowed through the chest at some point, and had only just recovered from that before she'd looked to them. Her sister meanwhile showed the most battle damage of all of the ascended gods, as ichor leaked down from the divine lips, nose and eyes of a fairly mangled face, showing she'd taken more than one direct hit to it. And even as she thought this, another blast managed to rush through her swing and thrusting limbs to strike against her chest, partially caving in the section above her breasts and bringing out a deep wince of pain and expulsion of blood-infused saliva from her open maw. Despite the pain though, she was able to push through it and stop herself from being disoriented enough for even more attacks to slam into her and her consort, though it was clear such a will would not last much longer if this kept up. Well, ngh. The only thing I can think of given the situation, is to wait for Beerus and hope that whatever he's trying to do will turn the tide. Prometheus' eyes then glowed brighter once more, and he chuckled with a greater deal of humor than Styx thought appropriate, at what his future vision showed him. Hee, and it looks like we aren't going to have to wait much longer for that. Laughter then rang out from up above. A mockful one, as the Titan who acted as the watcher and scout of Cronus' side gazed down with dark humor at his adversaries, with his fists clenched by his sides. Ha 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 ha. That's it, scurry or hide like the pests you are. Sooner or later, your pitiful defenses will crumble, and my attacks will pummel you all into dust. Splaying his arms out wide as he watched them futilely struggle to withstand his latest assault, he continued to bark with laughter at what he saw as his impending, and naturally one-sided victory. Do you see this, Beerus? This is what your dumb act of rebellion against us has wrought. Soon, your allies will be crushed under my heel for their stupidity in standing against me and my brothers. And once they are, you and then those ugly, one-eyed brothers of mine will be up next. And you can trust me when I say, I'll be sure to take extra care in breaking you for your hubris. Ha 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 ha. The derisive, mocking laughter continued on for all of about a second, before a brilliantly bright, dark purple pillar of light suddenly shot up far into the heavens and bypassed the barrier entirely. An intense pressure flooding throughout the peak of Olympus from the erected pillar, alongside an intense shockwave that rattled the divine mountain to its very core, and made even the holy air itself warp in disturbance. Hyperion's laughter fizzled away in an instant, the near-hysterical smile he'd held being wiped right off his face and replaced with utter shock as waves of dark purple aura spread out with the intense pressure that genuinely rivaled that of what he'd released during his ascension. What the? The Titan could do nothing but stare slack-jawed, as the waves that shot out from the erected pillar crossed over his hellish barrage of blasts, the sphere above him, as well as his previously constructed veil of heavenly light. And shortly after they made contact, Hyperion felt a frightening pulse inside him, as he watched with horror his heavenly light in all variants being swiftly reduced to violet particles right before his stunned eyes. Being erased out of existence around all the gods that were being targeted. My heavenly light. It's being eradicated. But how? Now no longer under the stress of being bombarded, Prometheus' barrier fizzled away as he, Styx and everyone else who'd been fighting Hyperion, the Titan himself, and the nymph stragglers all around the edges of Olympus' barrier turned their attention towards the pillar shooting skyward. Nobody missing the immense level of raw, divine power radiating from it, and the insanely destructive presence that came with it, as the entire air around the battlefield seemed to shift. What the is that Beerus? Zeus thought to himself in shock, with Poseidon and even Hades not being too far behind with that thought process as the gazes fell upon where they knew their elder brother to have stationed himself. This feeling it feels just like impossible, Hyperion gaped, in total disbelief at the familiar, yet different feeling he got from the now receding pillar of dark purple energy. This pressure, this presence. It can't be. The Titan's wide eyes showed just how flawed he was mentally, as he began to make out a figure appearing within the receding pillar, and easily recognized who exactly it was that had produced such a celestial power. Why, you are but a fledgling who has not yet existed for a year. Such a transformation shouldn't even be a possibility for someone like you. Is that so? The distorted voice of Beerus rang back out, and despite himself, Hyperion couldn't stop the sudden chill that went down his spine, as a dark chuckle resonated throughout all of Olympus. Being followed by menacingly glowing eyes, the deepest shade of amethyst glaring out from the steadily disappearing pillar of energy. I suppose no one told you then, that labeling something as impossible when it comes to me is pointless, for I am the impossible. Before everyone's eyes, the pillar finally fizzled away, quite like how the veil of heavenly light had before it, leaving a lone figure standing where it had previously stood. A blade held in hand by the figure's side in a relaxed grip, as it radiated a violet, godly aura just like the figure themselves that projected baleful and ruinous intent. The figure itself, which was distinctly male, being more slimmed down musculature-wise to a much sleeker build reminiscent of Hyperion's own, with the groin area covered over by magic like everyone else as their bare skin glimmered a dazzling, but foreboding dark violet. One that just from a glance alone, everyone could feel and almost physically see its destructive nature truly laid bare. The nails of the figure's hands both sharp and long, not unlike the claws of a cat, and the features of the glowing face only added to that, with sharper teeth and a more feline face structure that unknown to any of them, was identical to that of a furless sphinx cat. And as if to punctuate such an appearance, rather than long flowing hair, what appeared to be long, triangular ears that stood upright from the being's head. Glaring up at Hyperion, Beerus let what had to be the most savage smile he'd worn yet adorn his now, once again, feline features. The exhilaration that passed through him at having achieved what he strived for being unlike anything he'd ever felt in this, or his previous life. Be wary, you foolish excuse for a god. For you are about to take on a real god here and now. Raising the sword up to point it at his stunned foe, Beerus' glowing eyes glimmered brighter with nothing but pure malice and destruction in mind. The god of destruction. God of destruction. Hyperion's murmured, still in disbelief. Yet at the same time, there was no denying how eerily similar Beerus's presence felt to Perseus right now, who'd chosen to remain neutral in their conflict. Similar, but not the same. Beerus's aura felt far more wild and dangerous than the Titan of Destruction's ever did, despite them clearly being one with the same concept. All of you, stand aside. Beerus commanded, his distorted voice carrying powerfully across the courtyard and over his allies' heads. This one's mine, and mine alone from here on out. Your part in this is done. I'll handle the rest. At this point, everyone began staring at the newly anointed god of destruction with both awe and disbelief. Some not quite believing what they'd just heard, and no one was more so disbelieving, or perhaps even offended one might say, than the very titan who Beerus had just singled out. You'll handle the rest. Hyperion's teeth gnashed in anger, shrugging off the irksome urge crawling deep within his soul to cut his losses and attempt to leave now before things got ugly. You really think you can take me on by yourself just because you somehow have managed to ascend? The Titan's eyes burned with hatred and fiery, magnificent light as he glared daggers down at the son of Kronos. Hands balling into fists and becoming enveloped in blinding light spheres as his white golden aura flared around his divine body. Just who in Tartarus do you think you are, huh? Are you really trying to make me repeat myself? Beerus looked up at him like he was a complete idiot just for saying that. HMPH. You really are a buffoon, aren't you? Grr. Shut your mouth, you damn fledgling. The Titan of heavenly light roared, as he outstretched his arms in front of him, bring the spheres containing his fists close together, causing them to merge into a single one easily twice the size of either individually. I don't know how you managed to ascend so quickly, and I don't care either. I'll crush you all the same. With that, a massive beam of his heavenly light shot forth from the sphere, rapidly growing in size as it rocketed towards the stationary destroyer. Its size easily reaching upwards of a mile in circumference as it shot down like a heavenly bullet, rapidly approaching Beerus's location by the barrier in no time at all, and lighting up the whole area with the intensity of its shining splendor. It seems I'll just have to show you what I mean, Beerus shrugged, looking totally relaxed despite the whirring beam of bright death hurtling in his direction. Seeing as the severity of your situation hasn't quite sunk in yet, it seems. Bending at the knees, the god launched himself forward from his spot, shooting himself directly toward the approaching blast. His hand twisting the sword he held into a reverse grip by his arm, as he clenched the fist of the other, before thrusting it forward right as the beam got within arm's reach. The instant his fist, coated with his destructive aura, made contact with the end of the beam, it punched its way right through it, reducing what it struck to purple particles while sending out an added wave of power out, which quickly made the rest of the beam attack begin to evaporate. What? Hyperion balked, eyes bulging in shock and horror, as his attack was annihilated before his very eyes, reduced to particles in that disappeared before his vision even quicker than he'd conjured it in the first place. How did you? He was forced to cut that off, as he dipped his head back to narrowly avoid Beerus's follow-up punch as he flew up straight toward him in the blink of an eye, crossing the distance in no time flat and immediately putting Hyperion on the defensive. Pushing his body back away from the newly ascended destroyer god to try and create some space, but Beerus only followed just as quick. He only got a small window of time to see what had struck him, only to be further stunned when up in a backwards-facing kick straight into his chin, cracking teeth and sending his body soaring though, as the feline god of destruction was able to fly up in an arc within a short burst speed over his shooting frame. A madman-like grip's pommel, indenting his nose into his face and producing a massive shockwave felt throughout the mountain and beyond as he sent him careening toward the ground with a loud boom. His body crashing down and cratering the spot he landed on with a perforation half a mile wide and deep, making the whole mountain quake again in the process as another dust cloud was kicked up. Come now. Surely you can do better than that. You come back up here and try to. Beerus's taunt was immediately flashed a more intense amethyst as he pointed a hand down at the fast approaching barrage, and what proceeded after this was the two divine beings getting locked in a heated exchange of around them. Is that really Beerus? Hera muttered, struggling to keep herself steady and not to fall over from the excessive shaking of the mountain beneath her feet, which shook her breasts up within her arms' hold and nearly made them slip out altogether from just how bad they were rattling alongside the rest of her body. The fledgling goddess not quite believing the power she felt or the new form of her brother that her eyes saw, as she witnessed the two deities' forms blur and dart across the air above as they fought, crisscrossing through kilometer-wide distances at sub-Planck time intervals. Their movements far too swift for her to make out even the slightest action they made, and appearing more like they were both teleporting as far as she was concerned. Sisters, has he done what I think he's done? Yes. He has, Hera. Hestia smiled beatifically, clutching her dainty hands up by her ample bosom as she felt a sense of pride and vindication in her now transformed brother, as he fought with Hyperion on equal footing. The elder sister admittedly a bit confused herself at her brother's now more feline appearance, as was Demeter, but she pushed that tidbit to the side for now as it wasn't really important in her eyes. She and her blonde-haired sister also struggling just as much themselves to keep upright from the violent tremors that seemed to come not just from the ground, but from the air and space itself all around them, as her brother and Hyperion dueled. Even though I myself can scarcely believe he's done it in such a short time, our dear brother has managed to achieve his own true divine form here and now. And from the looks of things, it was already looking to be turning the battle's odds in their favor. So, this is what he had in mind, Nike mused, as she and her siblings watched on, descending to the ground below to keep the quivering air clear for the two's fight. A noticeable tint of awe in her voice, as they and everyone else obeyed Beerus's earlier command without question. They'd all found it silly to do anything else, it seemed, when they'd all felt the newfound power he'd achieved by entering into his very own ascended state. Every one of the other gods watching seeming to have a similar expression to her own at Beerus's transformation, putting the oddity of its cat-like appearance to the side. I can hardly believe it. Neither can we. Bea muttered, their brothers nodding in agreement as she and the others watched the god their mother had struck an alliance with duke it out with one of the elder titans at their full power. Neither seeming to give an inch in the high-speed, close-quarters battle that even she in her own ascended state had serious trouble keeping up with. Not like that matters now, though. The goddess and personification of force then grinned toothily with a feral and forceful air about her. The goddess appearing to take great pleasure in watching the altercation, and seeing both try to overpower their opponent, especially when it was clear to her as she watched further that Hyperion only seemed to be getting angrier and angrier. All while Beerus's cat-like face was just grinning madly at him the whole time, egging him on without words to come at him harder, which even when the Titan took the bait and did so, it was clear that unlike before when he was in his regular state, Hyperion no longer held an edge over him. He had the balls to tell us all to back off so he could take care of him alone, so all that matters now is that he backs that up and kicks this arrogant prick's ass. She yelled out excitedly, pumping her fists up in the air like a giddy child as the fighting went on. Styx couldn't help the bemused upturn of her lips as she heard her more rambunctious daughter cheer on Beerus's violence, as she looked up with some level of amazement at the deity she'd chosen to throw her lot in with, as he fought toe-to-toe with Hyperion. Almost at the point of chuckling hysterically to herself about how he'd essentially achieved his ascended form, which realistically shouldn't have been possible for him for some time. So, this is what he had us holding Hyperion at bay for. I must say, Beerus, you really are full of surprises. Glancing at Prometheus out of the corner of her eye, she saw the mad grin he held alongside a knowing twinkle in his eyes. Hey! No wonder he'd started laughing a moment ago. She might have too at the absurdity of this situation if she'd foreseen Beerus pulling his divine form out like he had. Incredible, to think he would achieve it so early like this, Themis whispered only loud enough for Epimetheus to hear, as she witnessed them both trade blows and whiz around the entire area up above their heads, meting out shockwave after shockwave with their attacks. How has he managed to accomplish this? From what I understand, he was still a ways away from completing the second stage of training for it. And yet now, he seems to have leapt over that entirely and brought his ascension to fruition in no time at all. It's the sword. Epimetheus revealed, catching the Titanus' attention as his eyes glowed in a similar way to his brother's when he was peering into the future, only for him, it was into the past for a brief stint. Now that's he done it already, I can see exactly how he pulled it off through my mind's eye. He used that blade in a similar way to how he channeled his divine power through it during his practice sessions with Gear's dummy. A dummy which had been blasted apart numerous times throughout this conflict and had rebuilt itself each time in the same location nearby, and looked to be the only thing technically a part of the mountain that wasn't shaking currently from the shockwaves of the god's blows. He was able to use it to control and pull off the process we all go through to enter our ascended states, and push himself toward ascension with it far quicker than he normally would have been able to, achieving what should have taken him years to get to in mere moments. Is that so? A light smile made its way over her lips, as this information brought up the thought of her one-eyed siblings who'd forged that weapon in the first place. Those three brothers of mine, they really have outdone themselves this time, indeed. What's the matter, Hyperion? Beerus asked amusedly and mockingly from above, ignoring the conversations happening below as he and said Titan shot out innumerable attacks from every angle they could, whilst blocking and evading them all the same. Though it was obvious that with all of his martial arts experience, he was having an easier time doing this and reading all of his enemy's moves than his opponent was. Especially given that throughout this exchange, he'd only actually made use of 3 of his limbs to stop oncoming blows, while keeping the arm responsible for holding his sword tucked by his side and unused. Why don't you try and pull that little trick you did earlier? You know, the one where you can make yourself appear anywhere you want instantaneously. Oh wait. Seeing an opening, the arm holding his blade finally thrust forward and sent the pommel once again careening right into his face, snapping his head back with a harsh crunch as his nose, which hadn't even begun to heal, was further broken, sending twin jets of golden, glimmering blood spurting out crushed nostrils as it was flattened deeper into his wincing face. You can't. Not now that I got rid of that eyesore of a veil you put up earlier. NNGH. Bastard. Head tilting toward his adversary, the Titan's eyes shined with murder, as out of nowhere, they fired out twin beams of focused heavenly light in the form of lasers right in Beerus' face. Something that caught the cat-like god off guard as they crashed into his face with enough force to knock his head back. And seeing what looked to be his foe well stunned by his laser eyes, orbs of light encased his hands as he thrust them forward and fired blast after blast of highly condensed, heavenly light bolts directly into Beerus's body. Each hard impact seemingly rocking and spasming his frame as the Titan riddled him like he was firing a rapid-fire machine gun. Muted into purple particles as soon as it did. The rest of the bolt, removing his fist from Hyperion's belly, Beerus floated backwards at a downward incline to follow the punch-up with a merciless side kick for the Titan's temple, which made contact with Hyperion's X-crossed arms instead as the latter was sent hurtling back tens of meters. Beerus dismissed the threat immediately. Something that only pissed off Hyperion even more, which was quite the feat, considering he was already at a boiling. Your ascension be damned. I'll pulverize you here and now. As his aura stretched further out from him, letting out what had to be its most blinding radiance yet mountain floor, with Beerus's non-ascended siblings almost following suit as they stumbled about, a being for every last ounce of his heavenly power that he could muster, with the sole intent of taking down the one god who above all at this moment, he had come to truly despise on a similar level to that of his tyrannical father. Ha! Meanwhile, getting into the fun of things, Beerus began doing the same, letting out his own aggressive scream as he powered up with his arms bent and fists clenched by his sides, digging down for as much of the divine power he now held that was possible for him. His aura soon growing out to the same size as Hyperion's, being just as dense and flary, whilst ignoring the ludicrously insane strain that was already coming over him, unbeknownst to those watching them. As soon as their auras stretched out wide enough to interact and clash with one another, they created even greater shockwaves around them that were felt greatly by everyone watching. And no sooner did this occur, did the two gods push forward at high speeds toward their adversary, both letting out a battle cry as they reared a fist back, coated heavily in their respective divine auras, and crossed the meager distance that had separated them faster than even several of the ascended gods could blink. They both struck at roughly the same time, thrusting their clenched fists forward at full force, which collided into one another with an ear-splitting bang as the opposing powers fought for dominance. A monumentally massive shockwave billowing out from the collision unlike anything that had come up prior, and even the other ascended gods ended up stumbling as everything seemed to shake around them. The ground, the air, space itself, nothing was spared as Olympus violently shook like never before, and it wasn't just the mythically massive mountain this time. Outside the barrier. What in the world? Thea yelped in shock, suddenly knocked off her feet and to her ass within the chariot as it horridly quaked rapidly about, the holy horses that drew it through the sky bucking wildly in shock themselves, as well as primal fear as the infinite heavens themselves warped and trembled furiously. The air kicking up into an unbelievable frenzy as tornadoes and gale force winds kicked up in the distance, whilst what sounded like sharp, crackling thunder boomed out from everywhere in the sky, like an unimaginable cataclysm was on its way. Something that hadn't occurred since the days of old when Uranos himself at the height of his power became angered. What in fucking Tartarus name is going on? Elsewhere the god of the wilds Pan cursed in surprise as he and his now panicked satyr and nymph followers either fell down similarly to the Titaness up high in the sky, or barely managed to hold themselves upright by hanging onto vibrating and rippling trees and rocks. The endless earth itself beneath their feet undergoing a tremendous earthquake all around that highly disturbed the few animals around them, but was much too violent for them to flee, not that there'd be anywhere to run off to anyway. As if Gaia herself had become angry enough to make her entire earthen body shake in a horrendous natural disaster. Around where the countless nymphs swam and lived their immortal lives, both in the innumerable rivers and even the boundless sea itself, the aquatic deities were stunned out of their skins as tsunamis suddenly kicked up all over and ragdolled their unprepared forms across the waters. Whirlpools and twisters surfacing en masse like never before throughout the unendingly deep waters of the ocean at the same time as well alongside brutal storms the likes of which had not been seen in ages past, all at once and without warning, as all of its waters' inhabitants witnessed the boundless sea ring. And various rivers fared no better, splashing and rippling in ways they'd never done before, with a number of them even being upturned in some cases with the shifting of the earth, forcing the nymphs bound to them to go into a panic themselves as they desperately tried to save their homes and what bound them to their immortal lives from being desecrated far beyond repair. Where did this trembling come from? Finally, back a ways away atop Mount Othrys, Atlas and the rest of the Titans under the Titan King's command also stumbled somewhat with surprised expressions over the shaking, cracking and splintering floor, walls and roof surrounding them. More than a little taken aback as the naked nymphs charged with dancing sexily for their entertainment fell over, with some even dropping through the larger cracks created in the ground and plummeting with terrified screams down below. And sat upon the throne his father had once occupied as his fortress, and the mountain itself rumbled raucously, with even the mighty throne that allowed for sight everywhere on the world below cracking slightly by its sides. Kronos gripped his arms' rests hard enough to splinter them further. His expression thunderous as his cosmic senses went on high alert, feeling the unbridled power being unleashed miles and miles away that was causing such chaos, as his now glowing red eyes glared ahead of him into the distance. His mind able to deduce what was more than likely happening, and from the feel of the clashing forces, just who was responsible to cause this. To cause the entire universe itself to shake. Back atop Mount Olympus. Huragush. Both Beerus and Hyperion battle cried as a flurry of punches and kicks numbering in the hundreds were exchanged shortly after the universe-shaking fist clash. Yet more shockwaves, which while weaker than their first meeting of fists, were still quite devastating in the power that radiated out of them, as they were produced. With forearms hammering, knees clapping, punches smashing, and feet bashing up against each other in quick succession, being so absurdly quick that even the stronger gods ascended below them had a difficult time keeping up with all the exchanges as their limbs blurred about. All whilst weaker gods like Styx, children struggled to even make out half of the movements made between warring gods above, as they swung for the fences. Soon enough, their forms blurred into what essentially resembled flashing beams of violet, purple and white gold as they traced through the air. The latter crashing against the former first and causing a rebound effect for both before the purple one, while shooting forward like a star, steered up and slammed back into the white gold one for a counter, sending it flying up before it ferociously zoomed back down for revenge. This process repeating ad nauseum as the two opposing, godly forces soared around like super-powered missiles, crashing and smashing into each other for dominance all over the area well above the watching gods' heads, creating quite the spectacle for all onlookers who could perceive them. The magnitude of force behind each impact tearing up the mountain floor well beneath them, causing huge chunks of dirt and rock to be launched out and crumble into pieces everywhere around, and in some cases, beneath the spectating deities, forcing them to move to a different position, lest they fall over and be buried under the upturned rubble. The duo of dueling deities twisting and twirling around each other as they smacked into the other, before starting to zig and zag around, taking turns chasing the other as they brutally and powerfully belaboured into the other as hard as they could, before eventually shooting skyward with the white gold chasing the violet-purple streak. It was once they reached near the top of the barrier that the white gold streak collided heavily with the violet-purple, producing what sounded like a thunderclap as Hyperion's fists met with Beerus's open palm. The former baring his teeth in his deepest snarl of contempt yet, while the latter, despite holding contempt of his own, was still smiling smugly down at him, even when his latest punch morphed into a series of rapid-fire punches so quick, they left afterimages behind for the weaker ascended gods watching. None of which were able to land, as the feline-looking god of destruction stopped every last one of the faster-than-light punches cold with his palm and the occasional use of either of his knees. Through the hail of punches, Beerus, keen eyes were able to spot an opening yet again and capitalized on it, thrusting a foot down and ram it unto the Titan of Heavenly Light's chest. The attack knocking his breath away yet again whilst sending him shooting down toward the ground with a small, but noticeable concaving in his chest where he'd been struck. And while Hyperion was able to right himself halfway toward the ruined courtyard floor, he was not fast enough to react to Beerus's follow-up dive where he planted both feet down into his exposed ribcage, his head from the downed Titan, who clumsily stumbled up to his feet with a now shattered ribcage. Despite his rage fueling him though, Hyperion had more than taken spectrum, any damage he'd managed to inflict on Beerus throughout the short, but intense fight, attempting to flee in favor of continuing the battle. As just the thought, I will not be defeated. Not by you. Never. Swinging his arms out wide with another flourish, Hyperion looks like someone's already run out of ideas. The blasts pushing towards his front from literally every angle and then taking off his sides, and even behind him. Simply allowing the innumerable blasts of light to strike his aura-coated body from all sides, which kicked up one explosive burst of force after another. Of blasts that hit him dead on, and had he been any one of the other gods right now, being Avalon, he's just gonna stand there and take it. Poseidon muttered in disbelief to witnessing his destructive power's defensive capability. They weren't sure even it could sustain. He kept the salvo coming, raining down nothing short of utter demolition on his most hated enemy, which even with Beerus's aura that allowed him to eradicate the blasts that touched him before, should have been more than enough to overwhelm it this time and reduce him to nothing but a bloody smear upon the dirt. How does it feel to be blasted down by an endless deluge of my heavenly light, where all his beams of heavenly light were impacting, and past the still shunting bolts in all directions? Then, a dome-shaped wave of purplish energy shot out right before Hyperion's eyes, passing by him within an instant. And just like before, every single blast that was still being fired toward him, along with the 5 spheres of his heavenly light that hovered around him, became nothing. If you're done, I think I'll end this now. Beerus then thrust himself forward at full throttle, kicking up sizable chunks of the earth beneath him as he rocketed toward the speechless Titan. The latter stumbling back in a panic as the god of destruction got up close, pointing a hand with a sphere of condensed heavenly light formed by it futilely to attempt to create some distance between them at least. Garrosh! A roar of pain erupted from his throat then, as he was rewarded with Beerus swinging his glowing sword of destruction up in an arc and slicing said hand clear off from the elbow down. A spurt of golden blood and purplish particles firing out from the newly made stump, as Hyperion instinctively raised his other hand up and lit it aglow with a similar sphere of light, only for that too to get cleaved off as Beerus's blade swung back and claimed it as well. The limp, holy appendage falling ungraciously to the ground near its twin as another blood-spurting, particle-streaming stump from the elbow down was left in its place. The destroyer then pulled his hand back, angling the tip of the blade for Hyperion's open and exposed chest. Whilst the Titan meanwhile, despite losing both of his arms and feeling a deep pit of fear open within him, was able to push down what would have been paralyzing terror from the dire situation he was now in with the help of his hateful rage. As Beerus made to thrust forward to impale him. In that definitive moment, for despite the unimaginable speed gap the two held over her, Hyperion prepping for what could be his final form of defense, but also Beerus in particular as he lunged in. The twin sister spotting how, of his true divine form, and at the final stretch as well. Out of his divine form just before he struck home, given the speed difference she knew exists imaginable. And yet that was all that was needed. Managed to remain unharmed, and those recovering from being turned into paste earlier by said Titan's assault, couldn't help but shiver involuntarily. The stronger gods who'd been fighting previously simply stared at the sight that they beheld, as the sickening sound of them right down to the hilt. The momentum shoving them both forward, as the last vestiges of her Beerus's divine form fled. He and the Go-Red Titan ground to a halt on their feet a dozen meters away from their last spot, like anything he'd ever felt before enveloped him. Sunder and ripped apart over and over again, as a purple glow and those damnable particles fled, much everyone watching, just like Beerus's had done, Hyperion's previously majestic eyed of his aura with an expression of shocked horror and suffering. Did look more and more hauntingly ghost-like as opposed to the godly one he'd had not a moment prior, switch that had been unceremoniously flicked off in his impalement. And no matter his attempts to call upon his power in that moment, to his even graver shock, failed to give him anything other than a brief flicker of his aura, which therein immediately sputtered out. Despite the soul-shearing torment he was undertaking, Hyperion was able to somewhat turn his shaky gaze down at his most hated enemy since his own father. His once perfect sight now blurred, showing him three of the deity he so despised beneath him as a dizzying feeling began to take root in his mind. The next words he spoke coming with a stuttering difficulty, as though even his own voice was getting ready to leave him. What have you done to me? Put an end to your nonsense. That's what Beerus remarked coldly, before grabbing onto the Titan's quivery shoulder, and taking a wide step back as he brutally wrenched his divine blade back from Hyperion's shredded spine and out from his mangled guts with a sprinkle of ichor. A shockingly low amount dribbling to the ground from his open, garish wound as the Titan groaned and stumbled back, barely even able to keep himself on his feet as he stood on unsteady legs that threatened to tip over if he tried to exercise any more strength than what it took for him to remain standing. And that was what was beginning to terrify him. Something was very, very wrong here. Not only were his wounds refusing to heal, but everything felt so cold all of a sudden. In the fleeting moment he'd been removed from that sword, an unnatural chill had fallen over the disfigured Titan. One that, like his injuries, refused to go away, and if anything, only seemed to worsen as he desperately tried to keep himself upright, but it wasn't long before his posture drooped forward, with him hunching his back as though the mere act of standing tall at this point was becoming too taxing. All this compounded was enough to spur Hyperion to action. Without thinking on it any further, with a monumental amount of effort for something that should have been simple, he was able to take a step back without falling down on shaky legs and turn his head towards a certain section of the barrier. Then, pulling what little he could from his domain that was beginning to become increasingly more unresponsive, his eyes lit up and fired a highly concentrated, if extremely weak, set of heavenly light lasers towards the magical barrier. They struck home unimpeded, and briefly illuminated that section in a somewhat similar manner to how it had been when he first passed through into the closed-off peak of Olympus, but obviously in a much smaller and dimmer way than before. HMPH. I presume that was you sending a signal of retreat to your ally on the other side. Beerus spoke up again, recognizing the futility of such an action taken unless it was meant to act as a message for his cohort outside the barrier to flee. One that while fighting the Titan of heavenly light, he'd been able to sense hanging around mere feet away from it on the opposite side, whom he could recognize as the Titaness that had been with him earlier, when he and Styx had gotten the now defeated Titan to chase them far away from the previous place of residence before it could be compromised. Not that it makes much of a difference, but I suppose that was the smartest move you've made thus far. As I'm sure you're well aware at this point what a mistake you made by challenging the god of destruction, and not to mention everyone else here, to a battle by yourself. NGH, shut your damn mouth. Hyperion spat, forcing his blurry vision to focus and return to normal, even if only briefly, as he glared at Beerus venomously. You think you're so great, just because you managed to attain your own divine form somehow and get a lucky win against me. Lucky? Beerus rose a brow. Are you actually so delusional that you'd call such an utter defeat luck? HNGH. I'm not the one who's delusional here. Pushing down the terror that crawled over him, the Titan managed to step forward again to face Beerus with his front, albeit shakily. His legs quivering like leaves during a breeze as every holy muscle in his body felt numb and consumed with a level of exhaustion unlike anything he'd ever felt before. You may have managed to defeat me, but I promise you, my brothers and dear nephew will avenge me. They will crush you all for this little rebellion, even without me there to aid them. Oh really? Beerus brought a hand up near his mouth and yawned. A sudden wave of tiredness beginning to flow over him, which he ignored for the moment in favor of addressing his defeated foe's lunacy. Somehow I doubt that. If your performance is anything to go by, then I shouldn't have too much trouble taking him out in the future either. Hey, Hyperion chuckled weakly, feeling himself get colder and weaker by the second, as the pure air passed over and through his grievous wounds. Is that what you think, little fledgling? The Titan's weak chuckling faded, as it was replaced by a deep scowl filled with burning hatred as he met the destroyer's gaze. It seems to me that you're the one who's truly delusional here. His eyes then swept out across the area at the other gathered gods, his and his brethren's enemies. You and your allies both, NRGH. It's truly beyond pathetic, how little clue you have as to what's to come. What is this moron yapping on about? The god thought to himself, beginning to grow weary of his bested opponent's chatter. Which only added to the tiredness he was already feeling. When Thea, my sister-wife, returns to Othries, there won't be any more hiding for you. The Titan took a deep breath in and out to steady himself, before what remained of his teeth were bared in a snarl as he kept the lingering dread in his heart under control. The one brought on from Beerus somehow shutting off his healing ability as well as drastically weakening his power with that final blow he dealt with that blade. Actually, no. That wasn't quite accurate. It was more like, the very bond he maintained with his divine domain had somehow been wounded. Cut into just like his physical body was right now. Not totally severed, as he could still feel it bound with him, but damaged enough to the point where calling upon it in any capacity had gone from being natural for him, to suddenly feeling foreign. Like the metaphorical bridge that connected him with his domain and made them one and the same had been almost totally destroyed, causing a backlash effect that was being felt by his entire being because of it. Hyperion knew of only one other weapon in this world capable of something like that, and the fact that this punk now had his own version of it made him even more fearful of what the new god before him would be capable of if allowed to reach his full potential. He didn't allow this to show on his face though. What remained of his pride could never allow this bastard to know of the fear he'd struck into him with his terrifying potential. He'd instead put his faith in his brethren, particularly his king, and youngest brother Kronos to put this upstart down before he achieved the potential and became too powerful for any of them to deal with. Thea will tell him where you're all hiding, and when she does, it'll only be a matter of time before they lay siege to your little sanctuary. The Titan proclaimed, a hoarse laugh rising out as he had to force his numb legs not to buckle, doing his best to muster as much confidence as he could in his words. And when they do, if you think your little barrier can keep you safe, then you're in for a rude awakening once Kronos brings out his scythe. Vision beginning to blur again despite his best efforts to keep it focused, the once mighty Titan became hysterical, convincing himself of what he was envisioning being how things would play out. He'll cut through this little barrier of yours, and when he does, him and our allies will take all of you down for daring to stand against us. Hyperion cast a brief glance past a now scowling Beerus, his vision becoming blurrier as he looked to where he knew the god's sisters to be in particular. His now horrible sight not enabling him to notice that at that moment, that one of the three sisters was absent from where she'd been, before he moved his fading sight back to the destroyer god. He'll tear you, your supporters, and your most especially your worthless siblings apart, and cast your remains down into the deepest pits of Tartarus for your transgressions. No one will be spared, not even those whores you call. CRRRUUUUNNNNCH. NRNGH. Hyperion's eyes shrunk to the size of pinpricks as his dialogue was cut off, his hoarse voice rising up to a squeaky pitch as a brief, but horrendous pain flooded back into his system. His feet rising up to where his toes barely touched the ground as his disfigured body stilled up. Those who saw what had happened, either cringed or smiled viciously as Hyperion was finally shut up, and in Beerus's case, the growingly tired god blinked bemusedly as the front of a pale foot was smashed up in a brutal kick to the Titan's groin from behind. The blow strong enough to send out a small shockwave as it partially lifted him from the ground, and it didn't take a genius to figure out that the crunching sound was from the mouthy god's balls being utterly crushed from the force of the kick. Barely a second later, the Titan slowly, like a tree that had been repeatedly cut into by an axe, tipped over to the side until his body impacted against the ground on his hip with a thud. Eyes rolled back into his skull with a fixed expression of pure, unadulterated agony on his chalk-white, unconscious features as his face looked out towards his gathered adversaries without seeing. Behind where he'd been, the nude, superbly bodacious form of Hera stood, lowering her foot back to the ground with a hand still firmly covering her sex, while the arm of her other wrapped over and covered as much of her bubbling, jiggling boob flesh as it could. Her expression a mixture of disgust as she glared down at the felled, effectively castrated Titan alongside savage satisfaction at what she'd just done to him. That was for humiliating me and for having the gall to suggest me and my sisters become your glorified sex trophies, you repulsive pervert. The beautiful goddess sneered contemptuously, unable to hold back the upward curl of her lips at the abhorrent Titan's current state after all the crap he'd just given them. You deserve nothing less after all the hassle you just gave us. RHHAAAA. Beerus exhaled in an even deeper yawn, briefly closing his eyes as he was hit with a sudden bout of lethargy, as his attention shifted fully to his buxom sister. You certainly didn't waste time getting over here to get your lick in once he'd essentially become harmless. I didn't even see you coming, the god let off with another rumbling yawn, while throwing a vaguely intrigued look her way. HMPH. That barrier he put up preventing us from shapeshifting and dematerializing crumbled shortly after you stabbed him. The goddess explained, glancing over to him before looking back down at the downed Titan, upturning her regal nose at him in derision as she continued on. I felt it happen, and after getting a little too sick and tired of listening to him ramble and throw his hollow threats at us, I materialized over here and shut him up. Preferably for good. She added at the end, able to see with her angle above him beneath the scarf that fell over his motionless body at his crushed sack, which, like the other wounds over his body, refused to heal. It appears whatever you did to him has made this cretin unable to heal himself anymore. Hopefully that sticks, as I think this new shredded, ball-less visage suits such a pathetic, perverted joke of a god like him. Demeter and Hestia, seeing their younger sister do what she did, and sensing the breaking of Hyperion's barrier also, were quick to teleport from their position away from the battle to join up with her and Beerus. The latter being greeted by a big hug from his side as the straw-blonde beauty damn near barreled into him, making him partially stumble as the goddess-clothed breasts squished into his arm whilst hers circled around his waist. "Oh brother, you never cease to amaze, do you?" the young deity said excitedly with a wide, beaming smile as she deepened her one-sided embrace with a now somewhat flustered Beerus, flattening her soft, perky mounds against his dense arm even more. "You've managed to achieve a true divine form of your own so soon, and claimed victory in battle against such a ferocious enemy. And all to keep us protected from harm once more. You truly are one of a kind." A part of the god wanted to tell the overly excited goddess to calm it down with the affectionate gesture, but found himself too tired at the moment to bother, so he just let her get away with it. Plus, he did appreciate the compliments all the same, what with how they rubbed his ego the right way. "I'm glad you were able to finish it," Hestia remarked softly, catching Beerus's attention as she placed a hand on Hera's shoulder to calm her down. The latter having looked ready to start stomping on the fallen titan for added spite before she felt her oldest sister's presence, simmering her remaining temper down enough to where she left the defeated Hyperion be. "Though I would much prefer if everything could be solved without such violence, it is still good to see this battle finally concluded." Her glowing eyes were full of care and love as she met her twin's gaze. "And even more so to see you safe and victorious over one of our shared enemies." The god of destruction chuckled lowly, knowing she'd played her role well at the 11th hour. "Probably wouldn't have been without your last-minute intervention. Something he perhaps wouldn't have needed if he'd gone in for the kill a little earlier than he had, but that was on him for wasting time messing with Hyperion in the first place. Call him spiteful, but after all the annoyance the Titan had caused, he'd say the time had been well spent watching his foe's hope for victory get steadily crushed, if only for his own pleasure." Beerus continued. "Don't think I didn't catch you using your power on him to give me the advantage at the last second. And without him giving a signal, he might add. She'd just judged correctly when to bust it out on her own, which had proved invaluable in this situation. Normally, I'd be quite annoyed at someone stepping in during one of my battles, but this occasion I most definitely consider an exception. You have my thanks for the assist, Hestia. And you mine, dear brother, for defending us once again from the harm that Hyperion intended to bring on us all." She replied warmly. Her comforting aura, as always, cascading over him and everyone else to make them feel even more soothed, as she stepped closer to him. Her arms encircling around him from his other side as she hugged him fondly, which didn't really surprise him. If anything, given how her aura was blanketing over him, he even somewhat welcomed her doing so, as he ignored the feeling of her larger, pillowy boobs pressing into the arm holding his sword, bulging their voluminous flesh out around it from within her tunic. "Hey! Don't go forgetting about us now." Zeus piped up with some amusement, as he and the others came toward them, some bit of relief on their faces knowing well at this point that the battle was over. Hades reappearing as his helm vanished on his command, while those who'd been in their true divine forms up to that point powered down back into the normal forms, tunics intact. "We all played a part in this battle today, after all." "True." Beerus nodded lazily, as he regarded their approach. Though not out of a lack of appreciation for their efforts, but more so for just how fatigued he felt at the moment. "You all did good keeping him distracted. Much as it pains me to say, without your help there keeping him occupied, I'd never have been able to pull off what I just did. Ha! Much as it pains me to say." "Good grief, Brother, of all the ways you could have phrased that, you just had to pick the begrudging one, didn't you? Zeus quipped back with a light-hearted laugh, obviously taking no real offense to it, and finding his brother's wording more humorous than anything. A sentiment shared by most of their allies, with those that weren't simply being unfazed by it as they all came to a stop in somewhat of a semicircle around the four siblings and their fallen foe, looking between his older sister and the downed Titan. The young girl nose at him again. Like she was a queen looking down on the dirty. Finally over. Demeter sighed in relief at their victory, which got a nod from Hestia in agreement. Both seemed to have the same idea then, funnily enough. The two pushing themselves up on their tiptoes, rolling and sliding their mashed cleavage up the purple-haired god's arms to give the fatigued Beerus aging from their embrace of him. Indeed. As he rather lethargically rolled his eyes at the gesture, along with the brief flicker of annoyance in Hera's eyes aimed solely at Demeter for hers. However, although, I hate to ruin the mood, but I fear there's a chance that Hyperion's last threat may not be so hollow. The destructive power of the scythe Kronos wields cannot be underestimated. Are you serious? Poseidon groaned while stabbing the butt of his trident into the ground, standing next to Zeus as he looked over him to his consort. Lying to himself so that he can take solace in his delusion. And speaking of that, the second youngest of the seven showed no sign of healing in any capacity from the wounds inflicted by his older brother and the most recent one done by his elder sister. His expression conflicted, with a mix of pleasure at the battle's end and their victory, but also bafflement at what had been done to you is quite the fearsome weapon indeed. Not only did it enable you to achieve your true divine form from what I saw, but if my eyes aren't deceiving me, has also managed to shut off the healing ability intrinsic to us all. Poseidon speaks the truth. Hades nodded, intrigue and awe in equal measure mixing over his features as his gaze fixed on Beerus. I've personally witnessed you be able to slow down the healing process before, somehow, but now, thanks to that blade, you're at a point now where it seems you can stop it full on, and deal some brutal damage along with it. Hades' grin was positively savage for a brief moment as he glanced down at the dismembered Titan, whom had caused them such hassle up to now. I have to admit, brother, I think I might be a bit jealous of what that sword of yours is capable of. To reduce such a powerful adversary to this kind of pitiful state, it truly is a marvelous weapon indeed. That's certainly one way to put it, Hades. The Oceanid consort of Zeus thought to herself as her eyes flicked over to the pale deity, in no way disagreeing with his assessment, as she too was quite fascinated by the sword's power in particular. She pushed her curiousness over it to the side for the moment though, to get back to what she believed was the more pressing matter. We'll need to start preparing for a siege right away, she vocalized with a dead serious tone. What I spoke before was no bluff, contrary to what Poseidon may want to think, and as much as I wish he was right. Now that they'll know exactly where we are, I can virtually guarantee you all that Kronos will make a move. He'd have to be downright foolish to not at least attempt to breach our defenses and invade us once he knows where we are. And given the weapon he wields, that is absolutely something he and his forces can do. Shit. That scythe of his is really capable of that. Poseidon frowned deeply, seeing how unwavering the intelligent Titaness in backing up Hyperion's final claims. Yeah. I'm sorry to say, but it's indeed capable of it, Poseidon. Everybody, outside those who'd been little more than collateral by the barrier walls turned, as it was not Metis who spoke back, but the one-eyed giant Arges. the Cyclops having materialized just a few feet behind the assembled gods with a rather grim look etched unto his features. If it could reduce the former ruler of the universe, my father Uranos, a primordial of equal power to Mother into but a shell of his former self, unable to take physical form and with little influence on the world even to this day, it's entirely possible that it could allow him to breach the barrier. In fact, it's a certainty that it can. Poseidon cursed under his breath again. Damn. We only just managed one of those assholes just now, and you're telling me we'll have to get ready for a full-on confrontation with the rest of them. Hyperion was a special case due to his divine domain. The biggest reason he caused so much trouble was because of his heavenly light allowing for near-perfect elusiveness, which I can tell you right now cannot be said for the other Elder Titans. Styx was swift to reply coolly while placing a hand on Poseidon's shoulder, somewhat calming the younger deity down. And leaving that aside, while I understand your grievance, such a confrontation with them was inevitable, given we're at war. I'm aware of that, Styx. Poseidon sighed, his shoulders sagging. I just didn't think we'd be having to deal with something like that so soon. I'd hoped it'd be a while before we'd have to concern ourselves with a grand battle on that scale. Well, it would appear we're not going to be that lucky, so no use crying about it. Beerus yawned loudly again, his vision beginning to blur somewhat as everyone's attention went to him. His tone holding more tiredness to it than annoyance at the prospective invasion Metis was predicting. In any case, he went on, glancing up at the one-eyed giant, rubbing at his eyes with one of his hands when the Cyclops appeared much blurrier than he'd like. What I'm more concerned with is that this barrier you and your brothers set up doesn't seem to be as protective as you'd let on, given how a certain pest managed to get in. Ah, yes. It would seem we may not have accounted for all variables when it came to him. Arges rubbed his head a little embarrassedly while giving Beerus an apologetic look. We felt him push through the instant he did, and honestly felt silly when we realized how he'd done it. The one-eyed behemoth shook his head, as though in disbelief he and his brothers hadn't actually thought of the now defeated Titan doing whatever he was thinking of. Turning his single eye down to look at Hyperion, Arges grumbled. I'll give him credit for using his head, at least, even if all it got him was a resounding defeat, which I suppose is the silver lining in him being able to breach our barrier. Raising his head up, Arges' single eye seemed to point towards a specific section of the barrier, which to any other observer, would have looked untouched. It was over there, I can see it clear as day with my eye, even if the rest of you can't. A hole on the outer layer of the barrier. One far too tiny to be seen by your naked eyes. The kind that would get him nowhere if he were simply trying to brute force his way in, but he was a bit more clever in this instance. Putting his hands on his hips, the Cyclops' only eye narrowed. He used his rather unique domain, his heavenly light, and funneled it inside that small perforation he made on the outer shell. From there, given the residual magic I can still make out, he must have steadily worked it through the rest of the barrier, slowly peeling his light through, until he'd gotten just enough of it out on our side to force himself to materialize inside. A neat trick that only he could have done, he coldly complimented, while glancing down one more time at his fallen brother without a lick of sympathy. And a fat load of good it did him. Letting his sword finally disappear from his hand, Beerus' eyes felt heavier than ever as he let out a long, drawn-out sigh. Feeling too drained to muster up any real annoyance at the oversight. Fat load of good it did him, indeed. Beerus turned away then, looking at no one in particular as he continued. In any case, our current situation is as Metis said. Follow whatever she says needs to be done in order to prepare for those buffoons' future siege. Metis blinked, a little surprised at how willingly he'd just put her in charge. You want them to follow my instructions instead of yours. You have a good head on your shoulders, and seem to have everything figured out, so why not? Beerus turned a lazy, but acknowledging eye toward her, trying to ignore just how badly her figure was blurred out of focus. Zeus has complimented your intellect quite extensively, and so far, you've given me little reason to doubt what he's said. I'd say you'll be more than wise enough to handle it. That is, of course, unless someone thinks I'm wrong and would like to step up instead. Nobody dared do so. In fact, they all seemed to look towards the Oceanid with confidence, which was probably down to a mixture of what she'd done to help thus far, and the fact that Beerus had so openly vouched for her. Metis' lips quirked up proudly, unexpectant of such naked praise from Beerus, but highly appreciative of it nonetheless. Well, when you say it like that, how could I refuse? Her eyes flicked affectionately over to her consort Zeus for a split second, and noted the bemused look back he gave her, clearly having not expected Beerus to throw out such a compliment for her like that, but like her, was far from displeased by the gesture. I'll be sure to reward such trust in me with the greatest results I can muster. I swear it. She proclaimed with conviction, as she stuck her hand out for Beerus to take. Good. That'll do. Beerus didn't hesitate to take it with his, symbolically sealing the deal between them, as it were. And once they released, a great weight of drowsiness pressed down on him like never before, and suddenly even just standing up felt like such a chore. The arm that had been holding and covering her breasts coming unglued, pressing his face comfortably into her deep ravine of soft, pale cleavage, as she dropped to a knee and allowed him to sag down to his to better support him. Brother. Hestia was the first to react outside of Hera, immediately kneeling by her brother's motionless side with instant worry, as was Demeter on his other side. Question to no one in particular, echoing all of his fellow siblings' thoughts at Beerus's unexpected fall. Inwardly crushing any envy he may have felt for his brother in that moment, his face was in their sister's bountiful globes, as his hand outstretched in the air with uncertainty. Hesitating as though he wasn't sure if grabbing his immobile brother was a good idea, even if he was currently being held up by their sister. What's wrong with him? I don't know, Hera was the one to reply, looking none the wiser herself, as her face was alight with perturbance. The usual attitude she normally carried, even just a minute ago, alongside any distress over her state of undress having vanished in a heartbeat in place of genuine worriment for her brother. One moment he looked fine, if a bit tired, and now he's, well, I'm not sure. He looks, pale. Demeter noticed right away, as she grabbed on softly to one of his dangling hands with hers and held it up in an attempt to show comfort. He looked much paler now than Hades did, like most of the color of his body had been seemingly drained out in the last second or so. Not as bad as Hyperion, who'd gone chalk white, but it didn't look good, that was for sure. I can still feel his breath on me, Hera remarked with a light blush to go with her worry, as she felt the god's incredibly shallow, but warm breaths upon her soft, perky flesh. It's weak, but it's there. Which was something, at least, given the fact that the Titan laid out near them hadn't so much as made a peep since his fall. He's still fairly warm too, she noted further. Not entirely sure why she had, but assuming it was a good thing, given the brief instant where she'd had contact with Hyperion last, his body had been so stone cold it almost felt chilling on her divine skin. Having finally broken out of their own stunned stupor at Beerus's fall, Metis and Styx were quick to maneuver their way over and crouch down by Hera's side while the rest watched on. Their eyes getting a good look at the deity's paled features sunken over with an extreme level of exhaustion. It looks like he's somehow lost consciousness. Metis was the first to speak with a brief, but astute observation, as she brushed some stray hair of his out of the way to get a better look at him. Indeed. Styx nodded in agreement, as she checked up on the god that she'd personally allied herself with for a better regime. The knuckles of her dainty hand coming to rest lightly upon the only portion of his face not pressed down mostly into Hera's breasts, his forehead. Her senses kicking up just as she did to try and analyze his condition, and it didn't take long for her to discover something quite troubling. It's not just that, though. His power has dropped dramatically compared to what it normally is in his base state. How badly, exactly? Hestia asked worryingly, barely sparing a glance at her fellow goddess before turning her sights to her twin's unconscious form, as her hand moved to caress his back. Her aura pulsing out in full effect, primarily on him for support as she did so, but for the first time seemingly to little effect. To put it simply, if it weren't for me being in contact with him right now, I don't think I would even be able to feel his power at all, which said a lot, given once she was able to identify his power upon reaching the Isle of Crete, she'd never been able to lose track of him, no matter how far away he'd been from her on the island. Such was how easy it was to sense out his impressive power dwelling within him. This is quite the disconcerting predicament. Damn, Zeus cursed under his breath. Not understanding why this was happening now of all times, when they'd have to start preparing for the bastard father's highly probable invasion as soon as possible. Why is that, though? He asked, more of his consort than anyone else. How come he's suddenly like this now? I don't recall Hyperion having done any real damage to him while he was in his true divine form that could warrant something like this occurring. That's because Beerus's current state has nothing to do with anything my son did during their battle. Zeus, and indeed pretty much every one of the gods' heads turned to their right, where the body of Hyperion lay, as a familiar feminine voice for many of them rang out. All eyes focusing in on the arriving form of the primordial goddess of the earth herself, as she appeared before them all. Her arms crossed beneath her large breasts, pushing their mushrooming, voluminous flesh upward as they were propped on her forearms. Her lips set in neither a smile nor a frown, as her vibrant green pools fell upon her student with a look that told everyone she suspected something like this might happen. Mother, you're here," Arges briefly stuttered at his mother's sudden appearance, having not expected her to just appear in her physical form like this without notice. He wasn't alone there either, as most of the others seemed to be somewhat taken aback at her appearing without warning and without anyone noticing until she'd spoken up. "Why no," he shook his head, cutting himself off from asking such a trivial question as, "Why are you here?" as the answer to that wasn't nearly as important as the more pressing one at hand. Before he could adjust and ask the proper question that needed answering though, Hera of all people beat him to it. "Gia, what do you mean by that? Do you know what's causing this to happen to Beerus?" "Yes, child, I do." The powerful primordial stepped forward, mounds jiggling around atop her forearms as she was careful not to step on her son's unmoving body. And as she did, both Metis and Styx were respectful enough of the ancient, gorgeous goddess to move away and make room for her, as she too crouched down by the still form of Beerus in Hera's arms. Her look changing the moment she was closer to her pupil into a solemn, but caring one as she gazed upon his unconscious features that weren't obscured. "The reason for his current state is simpler than you know. It's actually because of his true divine form that he's like this now. Because of his true divine form. Hestia parroted, face full of confusion as her eyes now flicked between the Earth Mother and her brother. What do you mean? What I mean, young one, is that your brother took a shortcut to achieve his ascended state in order to aid you all and win the battle. Because of which, just as I'd told him during my last visit could happen with his use of the sword, he is now paying one of the consequences for doing so. The sword. Hades blinked, catching on to her mentioning of his brother's symbol instantly. Are you saying his symbol of power had a hand to play in this? It had everything to do with this, dear Hades. For it was the very catalyst that allowed for Beerus to leap over what should have been years of work and dedication in the first place and reach the level of power that I was able to feel from my place upon Crete. She replied calmly, her knockers wobbling as she moved one arm out and placed a tender hand over Beerus's head and stroked his hair with a similar affection to what Hestia did for his back. An act which he most certainly would have been annoyed by had he been conscious. Do you have any idea what she's talking about, Arges? Themis turned to ask her one-eyed sibling, who glanced down to meet her gaze. You and your brothers were the ones who forged the blade she's talking about, so I have to assume you at least have some idea of what could be going on here. Honestly, I'm just as clueless as the rest of you. The Cyclops shrugged. We may have made it, and were aware of certain ways it could aid Beerus, but not a single one of us had the idea in our heads he could actually use it to ascend like he did. As soon as we felt him do that down in our forge, I must say we were quite shocked. He explained, not bothering to hide how genuinely baffled he was by it. We knew it could be used to harness his domain's power more easily, I can tell you that much, but even we didn't foresee that he could push that to a point of ascension. Then I suppose one of your latest creations has done a good job at exceeding your expectations, my son. Gia complimented with a light smile in the Cyclops' direction, proud of her boy's achievement, before she turned her sights back to her unconscious student. In any case, you all needn't worry too much about Beerus. From what I can see, his body has gone into a comatose state similar to the one any one of you knocked out of your true divine form would have to go through for recovery. Are you certain about that, Gia? Zeus asked politely, not wanting to come across rude to the Earth Mother after all the help she'd given him thus far, whilst ignoring his more perverted urge to ogle. Not that I seek to doubt your words, but from what Metis has bequeathed to me about how they function, this case seems a good deal different, given what you've just told us. I'll have to agree with Zeus. Metis nodded, keeping her eyes centered on the primordial. I mean no disrespect, Lady Gia, but this doesn't seem all that similar to me. I can personally attest to having seen one of my sisters knocked out of her ascended state before, and the comatose state she entered into didn't incur this kind of rough power drop like his has. Not to mention Beerus wasn't even forced out of his ascended state for this to occur. He fell out of it on his own, if I'm understanding this right. You are, my dear. Gia nodded affirmatively, confirming the Oceanide's words. That's why I said it was similar, not the same. In particular, for Beerus, he ended up running into an issue none of you who achieved the true divine form the usual way ever had to deal with. At least nowhere close to the same level, anyway. And that's strain. She revealed, giving one last stroke of the god's long, purple hair before she stood up. Her ginormous globes jiggling profusely as she folded her arms by her waist. He pushed himself to a level of power that neither his body, mind or soul were quite ready for, given he hadn't done the prerequisite training, and simply put, the effort has sapped him completely. Could that be another reason he handed the responsibility of being in charge of our defense against a coming siege to me? Metis immediately thought to herself, eyes drifting to the slumbering deity. Was he aware of just how drained he truly was before he fell unconscious, and knew that he might not be able to lead because of it? It was hard to say, given she couldn't see his thoughts, but it sounded plausible. Think of his current state like a flame. Gia continued, giving them all an analogy. Before, it burned bright and hot like an all-consuming fire. And now, for the moment, it's been reduced to little more than a smoldering wisp. The blaze will kick up again in time, but only when his being is properly rested after having so much strain put on it. She then turned her attention more so to Hera, who still held his head closely to her bosom. A smile coming over her lips as she saw how the goddess had seemingly thrown her normal attitude to the side, as she unapologetically hugged her slumbering sibling, and in her mind, potential future consort, close to her chest. I'd advise you to bring him to his bed for some proper rest now. Be prepared for him to be down for a while. An hour is much too short and generous for his case. I'd say he'll be out for at least a day, possibly even a week or more after what he just subjected himself to. Possibly a week or more. Zeus's eyes widened, as did quite a number of their allies and siblings. If that's true, then they'd have to hold down the fort without him. Something they hadn't done the best with when it was just one of the Titans, even if he had a unique ability to be wherever he wanted so long as it was covered by his heavenly light. If they managed to fully breach and invade Olympus with their full forces, there was a strong chance they might not be able to hold out with the current strength. Wait, no. This isn't our full strength either. Zeus almost slapped himself for forgetting the other allies they had which hadn't been on Olympus during Hyperion's attack. We still have those other gods we could call upon for backup, not to mention the Hekatonchirs that are settled down right now on Crete. If we get all of their help, then repelling Cronus' probable invasion should be more than possible. The latter especially, given the strength he'd felt from them while they were just lounging around, was truly monstrous. Beyond anything he'd ever felt up to that point, and perhaps even now still, seeing as he'd yet to see them get into a fight. I'll be sure to let Briareus, Cottus and Gyges know of what is most likely to happen soon. I'm sure you all will be needing their aid when Kronos makes his move. Gia remarked, as she brought her hand up and clicked her fingers. A vibrant green and brown spark lighting up when she did, before an invisible wave passed over everyone. The ground beneath their feet that had been torn to shreds and riddled with craters upon craters was swiftly fixed up, good as new, as though an intense battle had never taken place over and on the courtyard's grounds. And it wasn't just the ground either, as everyone heard the rapid sounds of stone and bronze clunking and clacking behind them. And by the time they'd all glanced back in the direction of the palace, it had been fully mended of all damage done to it during the battle as well. Looking as spotless and magnificent as it had when they'd first been shown it. Now then, if you'll all excuse me, the earth goddess turned, mountainous pear wobbling like jelly almost in the pure air of Olympus, as her gaze turned down to her fallen child. A far more somber expression overtaking her, as she looked down at the pitiful state her wayward child had been put in. It's about time I take my son off your hands. Falling to her knees again, producing a hefty bounce from her melons, the saddened goddess slinked her arms beneath the legs and neck of her ravaged son. Her eyes showing grief for how things had unfortunately ended up for him, as she gently lifted his near lifeless body up and brought him close to her chest. her bouncy boobs squishing and bulging out around Hyperion's waist as she came to a stand, holding him bridal style with his head softly resting near the crook of her neck. A part of Hera who watched her do that wanted to ask the Earth Mother why she could still hold such emotion for a piece of shit like Hyperion, and she certainly wasn't the only one either. She, like them though, held her tongue out of respect. She wasn't a mother herself. At least, not yet anyway. So, it was hard for her to conceptualize what kind of effect seeing him like that was having on her, as the one who'd given him life in the first place. Though she held nothing but contempt for the Titan, seeing Gia's current mood over what had happened to him was almost enough to make her regret smashing him in his genitals after he'd already lost. For she truly looked to be hurting emotionally the more she looked at his unmoving body crumpled in her arms. Oh, my dear child. It truly does pain me to see you like this. A doleful smile fell over the Protogenes' face. Tears almost welling up in her eyes the longer she looked down at his chalk-white form as she held her boy close, and felt just how cold his body truly was, along with his barely traceable spirit. Being so close, she could tell that his wounds ran deep, and without her aid could take centuries, perhaps even millenniums to truly heal. For as much damage as she'd known would be dealt in the war between the two groups, while she'd all but disowned Kronos for his heinous actions, the same could not be said just yet for the rest of her children that followed him. She just didn't have the heart to close off her emotions like that for the rest of them like she had her youngest Titan. Regardless of how bad they may have ended up as well, and she was by no means blind to that fact, she just couldn't bring herself to not be sad seeing one of her precious children reduced to such a state. For while he'd brought it upon himself with his actions, she couldn't help but wonder, as his mother, if, in a way, things were turning out like this because she'd failed him as a parent. No, not just him, but the rest of her Titan spawn as well. Even young Kronos, for as much as his actions of late had driven her strongly against him. Could all of this have been avoided if she'd been more attentive? If she'd tried to give them all much more of a guiding hand, especially after the travesty that was her former consort, Urano's betrayal by trying to lock them away. If after she'd aided her sons in taking down their father, she'd taken a more hands-on approach on rearing them just a little more. Would it have even made a difference, or were things doomed to turn out like this the moment Uranos had cursed Kronos on that fateful day millennia ago? Or perhaps, even before she'd chosen to act back then? She didn't know. The only thing she did know though, was that when this was all over, she hoped she could convince Beerus to show some degree of mercy to his uncles and aunts that were led by Kronos. She could deal with whatever harsh punishment was coming that son of hers way when all was said and done, but for the rest of her children on the opposing side of this war? No. She didn't think she could bear something like them being tossed into Tartarus again, even if objectively they might deserve it. Or worse, given the potential Beerus's symbol showed, being reduced to a similar state as their father, where their presence was barely even existent anymore, and might as well have been their equivalent of death. Something Hyperion was only one step away from now, following his defeat. With those thoughts in mind, Gia vanished from Olympus with her near-dead son cradled in her arms, much like how he'd been when he was but a newborn. Back before Uranos had cruelly decided he hated the sight of their children and tried to get rid of them. Back when things had seemingly been much simpler than they were now. The goddess hopeful that things would get better once this conflict was finally over. Just as soon as she'd left, it was Arges who broke the small silence that had fallen over everyone, as he let out a sigh while turning around. "I'll be down in the forge," he said, as one large hand of his began rubbing the back of his head. He hated seeing his mother in grief like that, but there wasn't much that could be done on that end, and he knew he had responsibilities to fulfill over here. Not sure if there's much else that can be done for it now, but me and my brothers will see if we can't go about making some improvements to the barrier. Doubt it'd be worth much against Cronus' scythe, but it's worth a shot. Okay. Metis nodded, her features setting into a much more determined visage as she stood up. Whatever you think could help Arges. Your efforts are very much appreciated. She got a nod back from the Cyclops before his form vanished, and with that, she turned her attention to everyone else there. All right then, you all heard Beerus. For this task, I'm on charge and will do whatever I can to ensure that we repel the siege that is sure to come our way, and I expect much the same from the rest of you. Are we in agreement on that? Definitely. They all answered strongly in unison, confident and determined expressions littering throughout the throng of rebels, including Beerus's brothers especially, as the trio rose to their feet as well, with Styx doing the same not long after. All of them feeling more than prepared to do what needed to be done. Good. Then it's time to get to work. The Oceanid declared loudly, almost as if to hype herself up for this as much as everyone else, as she immediately launched into allocating what she wanted everyone to do. Knowing there could be no more time to waste. Do not worry, brother. We shall carry on in your stead and have everything under control by the time you wake and get on your feet again. I promise you that. Hades spoke assuredly while looking down to his elder brother, even knowing he most likely didn't even hear him. His sentiment shared by both Zeus and Poseidon, who uttered similar pledges to their respected kin, before turning and beginning to move out with the rest of their allies as Metis was instructing. Willing to pull out all the stops just as he had done, in their own way, to hold this place down and quash any attempt to stop what Beerus and they had gotten rolling. Be sure to rest well, Beerus. Styx commented calmly as she too strode by, passing one last, respectful glance and nod at the god she saw as their de facto leader, before turning her attention over to her sister, and what role she'd be given in their defense. With that only left the unconscious god and his three sisters rooted down on that spot. Before either of her sisters could say anything though, Hera was quick to speak up. Hestia. Demeter. You two should go as well, be part of the defensive effort. I'll make sure to give Beerus a proper place of rest and keep an eye on him for when he wakes. You. Demeter blinked, before narrowing her eyes in suspicion. And just why should that responsibility? Before the blonde could even finish, both Hera's and Beerus's forms shimmered gold, before dematerializing right there and then, without another. Well, it would appear someone was in a bit of a rush. Surprisingly enough, this little moment got a snicker out of the eldest sister, as she saw how her younger sibling was response either. Unlike Demeter, however, she was more amused than to be the one looking after him in this instance. She did not just snub me like that. Demeter's eye twitched in agitation. Her mouth closing shut in an ever-deepening scowl as her head snapped over to the palace. The absolute nerve of her. He. Come along now, the way we can in the defense effort. But she, ugh, fine. Demeter sighed in annoyance, as she rose to her feet as well. Not looking pleased in the slightest with this arrangement, as she walked off towards the rest with a huff. Meanwhile, Hestia had taken his throne with space and time crackling around him as his scythe materialized in hand. His face set in a snarl as his eyes glowed a deep, menacing, red hue. His sights set squarely on Thea, who under her little brother's furious gaze wilted and flinched after having relayed what had occurred over at Mount Olympus. Her other brothers and nephew looked both equally stunned and pissed off at the same time around her, upon hearing the news of what had happened. She couldn't blame 'em, really. You mean to tell me that upon finding their hiding place, instead of racing right back here as you should have to get our support, so we could press down on 'em together, you let Hyperion go in there alone? Kronos' teeth gnashed hard with fury. And not only that, but now our greatest scout, and one of our strongest, our fucking brother, has already been defeated and captured by the enemy. Yes, I'm afraid so, brother. Thea bowed her head in shame. In retrospect, I should have tried to talk him out of it, but I too was blinded by my own desire to see our opposition taken out, just as much as he was. I allowed my brother husbands and my own emotion to get the better of us, when I should have been trying to get us both to think more critically on our situation. Had I done that? Grr. Excuses. Kronos growled as he tried to calm himself down. Already able to feel how whitened his knuckles had become from clenching the shaft of his scythe so hard. The fact remains that both of you let your feelings get in the way of the task at hand, and because of that incompetence on both your parts, that damned brother of ours has now been taken out of commission. Thea deflated further, having no real response to that biting truth. At least none that Kronos wasn't already aware of after she'd shared the tale. Atlas. The current king of the universe shouted authoritatively towards his designated general, who was quick to snap his gaze and attention to his liege on call. His expression giving away that he could already tell what their lord was about to order, as his massive muscles bulged in anticipation. Yes, Lord Kronos. Get all of our forces ready. The Titan Lord commanded, his voice booming through not just the room, but the entire fortress itself at this point, as his reddish aura layered itself thickly over his frame. We now finally know where those pests have holed up, thanks to my brother. His sacrifice, no matter how stupid it may have been, will not be in vain. We shall storm that haven of theirs as early as the dawn of tomorrow, and we shall crush them there and then. Is that understood? Loud and clear, my lords. What say you? What else is there to say, brother? Iapetus replied with a dark expression as his aura flared. Anaglos and rebellious children of yours will be stamped out for their insolence. There will be no quarter given, especially not after them bringing about our dear brother's fall. Kronos nodded in satisfaction at this response, before his burning gaze returned to, you will join in on the front lines of the siege. He declared, leaned. Understood, brother. Her eyes narrowed as she looked up, a cold fury now replacing the shame that had been on her face prior, as her hands balled into "You've done to my brother husband. I swear it. For your sake, I hope you'll keep to that vow, because I will not tolerate another disgrace. The butt of his scythe smashed down upon the magic-enforced stone floor beneath him, causing a quake to be felt throughout the massive mountain, as the glow of his eyes grew stronger. All of you, dismissed. Now is the time to prepare for our siege. Do not waste it. Yes, Lord Kronos. His subordinates cried out in unison, before their forms all dematerialized to go ready themselves for what was to come, and in Atlas' case, to ready the rest of the troops. Left alone to himself then, Kronos turned his fiery gaze up to the ceiling, peering past the stony wall as his mind focused more on the heavens beyond. I hope you're watching, Father. It won't be long now before I demonstrate to you that your little curse means nothing to me. His eyes then fixed themselves in front of him, or more specifically, in the direction he knew Mount Olympus to be in. His eyes glow intensifying when he did. And as for you, Beerus, I hope you and your siblings have prepared yourselves. Because come tomorrow, This irksome rebellion of yours will come to an end, and I shall deal with you and your siblings in much the same way I dealt with your grandfather. Cut to pieces and thrown to the wind.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more what if video. Comment 3 hearts for more what if.